This is the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. Established in 1937, the building was completed in 1941. This building stands on the site of what used to be the 6th Street Station, part of the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad Station, a beautiful Victorian Gothic building constructed in 1873. Not long before 9:30 in the morning of July 2nd, 1881, a Saturday morning, the President of the United States, James Garfield, and his entourage arrived at this station by carriage. Garfield was about to head off for a summer-long vacation. He was scheduled to travel in a special train car to Elberon, New Jersey, where his wife Lucretia, whom he called Crete, was recuperating after a bad bout of malaria earlier that year. Then Garfield was due to visit New York State, Williams College, his alma mater in Massachusetts, and the place where his sons were going to be going to school, then to his farm in Ohio, and finally on a trip around the South. Throughout the carriage ride to the station, Garfield was discussing policy matters with his Secretary of State, James Blaine, who was not scheduled to accompany him, but who wanted to see him off. They were still talking as they got out of the carriage and walked into the station. Garfield's sons, James, age 15, and Harry, age 17, were also with him. There were no bodyguards or Secret Service agents present. Several members of Garfield's cabinet who would accompany him on the trip were already on the platform waiting for the president. One of them was Secretary of War Robert Todd Lincoln, son of Abraham Lincoln. Garfield and Blaine walked through the ladies' waiting room toward the platform with James and Harry Garfield behind them. They passed a man who had been waiting there for a few minutes. After they passed, the man, whose name was Charles Guiteau, drew a gun, a .442 caliber British Bulldog revolver, and shot Garfield in the back from a distance of less than 3 feet. Garfield staggered and shouted, "My God, what is this?" Guiteau, the assassin, took 2 steps forward and fired again. Garfield was at that moment falling to the floor. Though there were no bodyguards present, a Washington, D.C. police officer, Patrick Carney, was nearby, having greeted the president as his carriage arrived. He ran into the ladies' waiting room, as did others, including Robert Todd Lincoln. As Guiteau tried to run away, someone shouted, "Lynch him!" Guiteau was grabbed by a ticket agent just as Carney was approaching. The policeman grabbed him and hauled him away. Guiteau offered no resistance. He told the officer, "I am a stalwart. Arthur is now President of the United States." At the time of the shooting, James Abram Garfield, the 20th president, had been on the job only 120 days. Indeed, his administration was destined to be the second shortest in American history, second only to William Henry Harrison, the 9th president, who died in 1841, only 30 days after his inauguration. This is the bulk of what most people know about James Garfield, if they know anything at all. Briefly president during the Gilded Age, when there were a lot of bland-looking white men with enormous beards or mustaches cycling through the White House, Garfield was the second U.S. president to be assassinated, and his administration was so short that the only real mark it made on American history was for that fact alone. More people can probably name characteristics of Garfield, the cartoon cat, than they can facts about the real James Abram Garfield. The real Garfield is not known to have hated Mondays and probably never tasted lasagna. As you'll see, there's a great deal more to understand about Garfield than the facts about his death. He was quite unique among U.S. presidents in many ways. Sort of an unexpected surprise among the milquetoast, highly forgettable chief executives of the Gilded Age. And the story of his life is probably a good deal more interesting than you might expect. That's what this video is about, who Garfield was and what his place in history is. This is the story of Garfield, the president, not the cat. Hi, I'm Sean Munger. I'm a historian, author, and teacher. I have a PhD in history, and my niche here on YouTube is doing deep dive, in-depth videos on historical subjects that I think are underappreciated or more obscure than they should be. In addition to historical videos, I also teach history classes online, which you can see on my website, seanmunger.com. This video on James Garfield you might think of as sort of a follow-up to two other videos I've done in the last year on presidential topics, one being a biography of Franklin Pierce, the 14th president, and another on the highly unusual presidential election of 1872. Now, you don't need to have watched those to understand this one, but you might say they take place in the same cinematic universe, if that makes any sense. Because Garfield's presidency was so short, he presents a curious dilemma for historians and biographers. Necessarily, he's consequential in American history, and his 1881 assassination clearly is an important event. But Garfield, who was 49 when he died, spent only 6 months of his life as President of the United States, and 2 of those 6 months he spent in a sickbed, slowly dying. And as for the other 4 months, it's not as if big-ticket events like World War II or the Cuban Missile Crisis were going on during Garfield's administration. So, on the whole, is it even worth spending a significant amount of time getting to know this man? I think the answer is yes, and I think so because Garfield's life and career, before he stepped into that train station, before he even became a presidential candidate in 1880, stretch across a unique and fascinating period of American history, as the Civil War and Reconstruction eras were segueing into what we call the Gilded Age. Now, we're going to get back to Garfield and the train station in just a moment, but before we do, I want to lobby for the fascinating life story of James Garfield to get the big-budget Hollywood movie treatment. It'd make a really interesting film, and there is a blatantly obvious choice for who should play the title role. Andrew Garfield, of course. There's no relation between them so far as I know, but come on, the idea of Andrew Garfield playing James Garfield, how perfect is that? So yeah, make that happen, Hollywood. We're waiting. Much of this story has to do with civil service reform, and the question of whether government jobs should be given out on the basis of merit or as political perks. That was the question in Garfield's time, but it's still an issue today, and it's in the news today. For example, I found this story on Ground News about candidate Donald Trump's plans to replace large numbers of government workers, if he wins in November, with political loyalists, and how government employees in advance of the election are working to anticipate these changes. Ground News, which has been supporting me for quite a while now, is a website and app that organizes the world's news in one place from across the political spectrum. Let me show you how it works. On the website, we can see the story about the government jobs has been covered by 26 sources, most of them in the center of the political spectrum, but with equal coverage on the right and the left. Ground News shows you each story's political leaning. And if you look at this bias distribution, it gives an analysis on how the story is being covered across the political spectrum. Stories from the center are talking about how this is potentially authoritarian and could damage the government. Curiously, both left and right seem to be framing the story in terms of the candidate himself, either Trump reshaping the federal government or protecting Biden's accomplishments. Ground News has a lot of other great features. I love the ability to collect stories on topics that interest me. In archaeology, for example, we've got a story about fossils unearthed in India that came from a colossal snake that lived 47 million years ago, apparently the largest snake ever to live on Earth. As long as a school bus, not sure why that's the measure of comparison, but whatever, it's still pretty interesting. And it's something that I would never have found anywhere else. Ground News is a great tool to help you understand the information you consume and cut through the chaff and disinformation that's so prevalent in our media environment. And as in the giant snake story, it can be fun too. So if you go to ground.news/Munger right now, you can subscribe through my link for 40% off the Vantage plan, which is the plan I use every day. And for less than the cost of a coffee, you can stay informed and support my channel at the same time. Now, back to the historical story. James Blaine, the Secretary of State who witnessed the shooting, had recognized the assassin, who was now on his way to jail. Charles Guiteau was a notorious troll who'd been badgering Garfield and various administration officials since the inauguration some months earlier, and since before the inauguration, in point of fact. Guiteau is important to our story, no question about it. However, as this video is the story of Garfield's life and career as a whole, and the assassination is only a small part of that whole, you're not going to get any more significant material on Guiteau until late in the story, chapter 10. As Guiteau was being taken away by police, President Garfield was lying on the floor of the 6th Street station in a pool of his own blood and puke. He was conscious, but obviously in extreme shock. The ladies' waiting room attendant, a woman named Sarah White, tried to prop up his head and keep him as comfortable as possible. Dr. Smith Townsend, the chief health officer for D.C., arrived on the scene within 5 minutes. Dr. Townsend was the first to do the thing that eventually killed the president. He stuck his finger, which had not been sterilized, into the bullet hole in Garfield's back, probably introducing infection. Somebody found a mattress, probably from a Pullman car parked at the station, and they carried Garfield on it to an upstairs room. 9 more doctors arrived. One of them, Dr. Charles Purvis, surgeon-in-chief of the Freedmen's Hospital, was one of the first African-American physicians in the United States. Robert Lincoln, who had been in the next room at the time of the shooting, decided to make himself useful. He sent a carriage, one of many waiting outside the station, to fetch another physician, Dr. Willard Bliss. Yes, I said doctor twice there for a reason, and he soon arrived to join the others. This was one of the most fateful decisions made by anyone in the wake of the assassination. Like the unsanitary probing by Dr. Townsend, the appearance of double Dr. Bliss may have led directly to Garfield's death. I'll talk more about Bliss in a moment, but from the time of his arrival at the station, he tried to make it clear to everyone that he was in charge, even though he wasn't. His involvement was entirely the idea of Robert Todd Lincoln. The sources I used to make this video, you can see a list of them in the end credits and also in the description. Anyway, the sources conflict on exactly what happened in the upstairs room of the 6th Street station. I can't tell you definitively what's true, perhaps all the accounts are, but here is what is claimed. In some accounts, Garfield asked one of the doctors what his chances of surviving were. The doctor replied, 1 chance in 100. Garfield said, "We'll take that chance, doctor, and make good use of it." Another account of the scene has a slightly different tone. A doctor is said to have told Garfield that the wound wasn't that serious. Garfield is said to have replied, "I thank you, doctor, but I am a dead man." Double Dr. Bliss immediately pulled out one of his instruments, a probe with a porcelain tip. Unsterilized, Bliss stuck it directly into Garfield's bullet wound and spent several minutes rooting around in his insides. The procedure was so egregious that Dr. Purvis asked him to cut it out, but naturally Bliss ignored him. Then he did something even worse. Not finding the bullet with his dirty probe, Bliss did what Dr. Townsend had done, stuck his finger into the bullet hole. The president was obviously in agony, but he tried to bear up as best he could. He made one request of the doctors: take him to the White House. More mattresses were found, and the doctors fashioned a carriage for hire into a makeshift ambulance. As they brought him down from the upstairs room of the station, a huge crowd had gathered both inside and outside the building. The carriage took a very slow ride through Washington's streets, the driver trying as best he could not to jar the wounded president too much. Word was already spreading outward from Washington, both by telegraph and also in a highly limited way via a new invention that few people had at the time: telephone. In Elberon, New Jersey, Lucretia Garfield, the First Lady, had been notified. She immediately caught a train back to Washington. The carriage arrived at the White House, and Garfield was brought to an upstairs bedroom that had already been converted into a sick room. Double Dr. Bliss immediately began giving orders to the White House staff. One of them was that a party of armed soldiers was to stand guard at the president's room, refusing admission to anyone except those that Bliss approved. Although he had no official standing and wasn't even Garfield's normal doctor, Bliss had pounced on the opportunity to take charge. Let's talk for a moment about Double Dr. Bliss. I keep calling him that because it's literally true. His first name, meaning his actual name that his parents gave him at birth, was Doctor. His full name was Dr. Willard Bliss, and after studying medicine at the Cleveland Medical College, he could technically and legitimately be known as Dr. Willard Bliss. I know, it's nuts. His parents were apparently admirers of Dr. Samuel Willard, a prominent physician in the American Revolution era. Unfortunately, though destined by his name for medical practice in life, Double Dr. Bliss turned out to be something of a quack. He was a practitioner of homeopathy, which tells you a lot right there. But then again, hey, it was the 19th century. Before the Civil War, he hawked an obscure South American plant called cundurango as literally a cure for cancer. Partially for this quackery, Bliss was expelled from the Washington, D.C. Medical Society in 1853. To be sure, another reason the D.C. Medical Society expelled him was that he disagreed with their policy of barring African American doctors from practicing in the capital. But the cundurango thing certainly didn't help. 10 years later, during the Civil War, Bliss was involved in a bribery scandal while working at the Armory Square Hospital and briefly put in jail. He did manage to salvage his reputation over the next years and decades, ironically in part because of a good word said about him publicly by a prominent neighbor who knew Bliss while he was practicing in Ohio, one Congressman, James A. Garfield. So, just to be clear, this is where we are. President James Garfield, with a lead slug in his back, is sequestered in a White House bedroom, totally under the care and control of a doctor that he never asked for, Dr. Willard Bliss. His wound has already been probed with unsterilized instruments and people's dirty fingers. We're not going to return to this point in the story until very late in the video, chapter 11. Because Garfield's story is about so much more than his assassination, we have to start back at the beginning to get the proper context. Who was James Garfield, and how did he get to be president anyway? That's the subject we're starting on in the next chapter. In the 19th century, it was considered an asset for an American politician to boast that he was born in a log cabin, even if he wasn't. James Garfield, however, really was. It wasn't this self-same building, which is a replica built, if you can believe it, in 1999. But the Garfield family's home did stand here in what's now Moreland Hills, Ohio, beginning in 1829. Unfortunately, the only ground-level view on Google Maps is from the highway, so there's a certain amount of use your imagination here. James Abram Garfield, born November 19, 1831, the youngest of 5 children of Abram Garfield and his wife, Eliza Ballou, was named after an earlier son, also named James, who died earlier in 1831. The area of Ohio where the Garfield family settled, they had originally come from Cuyahoga County, was called the Western Reserve. Life was very hard for poor farmers, which was what the Garfields were. Indeed, in 1833, even before his son James was 2 years old, Abram Garfield caught some sort of respiratory ailment and died, leaving Eliza a single mother with 4 kids to raise and no money. She eventually remarried in 1842, but the marriage was unhappy and she deserted her new husband. He filed for divorce, which was granted in 1850. Divorce was extremely rare and quite scandalous in early America. James Garfield was reluctant to talk about this episode for his whole life. From an early age, James Garfield was interested in books. Education was as hard to come by in Ohio of the early Republic era as anything else, but when it was clear that he had a knack for books and reading, his mother made his education a priority, foreseeing correctly that it could lift him out of poverty. But at age 16, James almost scotched that idea by running away to work on a canal boat that was run by his cousin, a fellow called Amos Letcher. Canals were at this time a technology that was remaking America. Most politicians in this era realized that it was necessary to build a transportation network to tap the agricultural potential that was pretty much landlocked in places like Ohio and give it an outlet to markets that were accessible by sea, like New Orleans down the Mississippi and New York City, which after the Erie Canal was completed in 1825 became America's chief port. Goods, usually agricultural ones, were at this time often transported aboard barges that were pulled by horses. The horses walked along paths on either side of the canal, pulling the boats via ropes connected to them. Garfield's job was to prod the horses along. For some reason, history records that while doing this job, he fell into the water 14 times. Whether that's a lot or a little for this kind of work, I can't tell you. Garfield's career as a canal horse puller, or whatever you call it, ended after only a few months when he came down with an illness that in the 19th century they called ague, possibly malaria. He was sick in bed for 3 months. That meant he was back to the books. The following spring, after he recovered, his mother and a family friend arranged for him to enroll at this school, called Guiteau Academy in Chester Township. From that point on, 1848 until the outbreak of the Civil War, James Garfield's life was dominated by education. But religion was also a heavy part of this. The Western Reserve had in the 1830s been heavily proselytized by a preacher called Alexander Campbell, who converted numerous townships and churches to his brand of Protestantism, now generally called the Disciples of Christ. James Garfield's parents were all in on Disciples of Christ, and eventually James Garfield himself was too. He was officially born again in 1850. Garfield was very smart, but also not much of a party guy. He applied himself diligently to books, to learning, and eventually teaching languages, principally Greek and Latin, to preaching, and eventually teaching. That was really the only job open to him in backwoods Ohio. He began teaching at Guiteau Academy in 1849, about the same time as he met a classmate there, Lucretia Rudolph, known as Crete. The problem with Guiteau Academy was that it was founded on Baptist principles, and Garfield was Disciples of Christ. In 1851, he quit the academy and joined the new Western Reserve Eclectic Institute, a college that, despite its lofty-sounding name, was just a brick building in the middle of a cornfield. Lucretia Rudolph eventually transferred there too. After a brief romance with a girl named Mary Hubble, which Garfield suddenly broke off in 1853, he started to pay more attention to Crete Rudolph, who was in his Greek class and in fact was a star student. Garfield's first letter to her read, quote, "Please pardon the liberty I take in pointing my pen towards your name. I'm not sure Greek class is such a good idea for a first date, but whatever." Most of their courtship was conducted by letters. Within 2 years, Garfield had pretty much exhausted the intellectual offerings of Western Reserve Eclectic Institute, and he was looking to transfer to another college with broader horizons. This was a religious decision as much as an educational one. Transferring to Bethany College in Virginia, another Disciples of Christ school, was the natural choice. But if he did that, he realized he would probably end up as a preacher. He applied instead to Yale, Brown, and Williams College. Williams, located in Williamstown, Massachusetts, was the one that accepted him. In the summer of 1854, he arrived there, having by now firmly professed his love to Lucretia, but they had no immediate plans to marry. And in fact, it seems James had second thoughts about the relationship, but he did not break it off. Garfield graduated from Williams College in August 1856. Having now decided not to become a preacher, he accepted an offer to return to teaching at Western Reserve Eclectic Institute. Part of him didn't really want to go back there, but there was an interesting reason why he returned, one that informs our understanding of Garfield's broader career. In 1856, the president of the university, Amos Sutton Hayden, whom Garfield apparently didn't like, was on the outs with the university trustees. Word on the street was that he would soon be replaced, and if Garfield was there and on faculty, he would be the natural replacement. Publicly, Garfield claimed he didn't want to be the college president, but privately he said, quote, "I shall make no moves to bring it about, though perhaps I might echo the sentiments of Sam Houston. If the presidency is thrust upon me, I shall do as I please about accepting." End quote. In other words, Garfield seems to have wanted the position, but wanted somebody to offer it to him on a silver platter. This was how he would approach higher office throughout his political career, including, as we'll see, the presidency of the United States. Long story short, there was a lot of political maneuvering in the administration of Western Eclectic, but Garfield did eventually get to be its president starting in 1857, and after some dithering and apparently a flirtation with another woman called Rebecca Selleck, Garfield swallowed his reservations about marriage, to Crete, that is. In November 1858, James Garfield and Lucretia Rudolph were finally married after a courtship of over 4 years. He also quietly began preparing for another potential profession. Besides teaching or preaching, he started reading law, essentially apprenticing under a more senior lawyer, that being Albert Gallatin Riddle. In August 1859, a lucky accident paved the way for Garfield's entry into politics. A noted Republican politician in Ohio, one Cyrus Prentice, had been expected to stand for Ohio State Senator. But Prentice suddenly died about 2 weeks before the Republican convention was supposed to meet to choose candidates. A group of Ohio Republicans met with Garfield and suggested they put him up in Prentice's place. He agreed. On August 23, 1859, 14 ballots, James Garfield was nominated as Republican candidate for state senator for Ohio's 26th district. It was a really safe district, so nomination was tantamount to election. And 2 months later, he was in fact elected. That fall, all across America, the only political issue was slavery. Garfield had originally not cared that much about the issue, but by 1859, he'd become a strident abolitionist for political as much as moral reasons. In the fall of 1859, John Brown led a raid at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, which he intended to ignite a slave rebellion that would sweep away the institution of slavery. The next year, as Garfield entered the Ohio state legislature, what would prove to be the most contentious presidential election in U.S. history up to that point was getting going. With the Democratic Party splintered, the new or newer Republican Party, pledged to stop the spread of slavery to territories where it didn't already exist, was preparing to compete in their second ever presidential election. During the summer of 1860, as the election was taking shape, the Garfields' first child was born, a daughter, Eliza, whom they called Trot. Apparently the nickname came from Dickens's book, David Copperfield. Garfield wasn't home much in this period, going out on the road to stump for the Republican Party's candidate, Abraham Lincoln of Illinois. His efforts were well rewarded. Lincoln swept Garfield's district by a landslide, and Ohio went for Lincoln as a whole. As you probably know, the election of Lincoln as president triggered the secession crisis, which had been long in coming. Radicals in various southern states, seeking above all to preserve the institution of slavery, had for years tried to push their states towards secession from the Union. The election of Lincoln in 1860 was the justification they needed. South Carolina seceded in December 1860, and various other southern states followed over the next few months. Garfield was still in the Ohio Senate, but he took a hard line, counseling against any sort of negotiation to save the Union, and instead favoring an armed response. Despite his enthusiastic campaigning for Lincoln, Garfield wasn't a huge fan of him. He regarded Lincoln as a country bumpkin from the primitive frontier, lacking culture and education. He also wasn't sure whether Lincoln was the right man to stand fast against the pro-slavery states that were tearing the Union apart. On April 12, 1861, Garfield was in the Ohio Senate chamber when somebody broke in and shouted the news. Pro-slavery secessionists were bombarding Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. The war was on. In these early days of the Civil War, as the federal government was relatively slow to arm and organize, a lot of the burden of raising armies and putting them in the field fell to the states. Garfield offered his services as an officer to Ohio's Governor William Dennison. At first, Dennison told him that he was more valuable to the war effort remaining in Ohio's legislature. But in the summer of 1861, as various Ohio regiments organized, the calculus changed. In June, Dennison offered Garfield a position as lieutenant colonel in Ohio's 24th Infantry. Garfield had hoped to be appointed as a colonel, so he declined the offer. But eventually realizing that he pretty much didn't have a choice, he had to swallow his pride or else sit out the war as a civilian. When Dennison offered again in August, this time for the 42nd Ohio Infantry, again as lieutenant colonel, Garfield this time accepted. There was a problem, though. The 42nd Infantry didn't really exist except on paper. There were no troops, no weapons, no uniforms, nothing. Garfield would have to build it from the ground up and then, hopefully, take it into battle. The intellectual from Ohio had become a soldier. That was the next major phase of Garfield's life. how do you build an entire army unit from scratch, especially if you have no experience doing it? This was the problem James Garfield had in the summer of 1861. First, he turned to his students at Western Eclectic for recruitment. Many of his students were enthusiastic to join the war effort, but others wanted to wait until they could all serve together. Garfield scoured the countryside and used his experience as a preacher to mobilize recruits. He also utilized Disciple of Christ churches for his platform. Camp Chase, home base for the 42nd Infantry, barely existed. On the first night, Garfield couldn't even find a bed to sleep in except a pile of straw. Garfield whittled a set of wooden blocks to represent companies, battalions, officers, and men, and would march these blocks across his desk to teach himself the elements of infantry tactics and drill. When men did start to arrive, Garfield drilled and marched them for 6 to 8 hours a day. He used the wooden blocks he'd whittled to teach officers about tactics. He also went to Columbus personally to get proper uniforms for his men. You gotta hand it to him, he really did the legwork to build his unit up from nothing. The first battle assignment for Garfield's men was in Kentucky, a border state that remained loyal to the Union. It was invaded by a pro-slavery Confederate army commanded by General Albert Sidney Johnston. The Union armies in this area were under the command of General Don Carlos Buell. Buell assigned Garfield to stop one of the Confederate sub-commanders, Humphrey Marshall, in a place called Big Sandy Valley. Buell had left every detail of the campaign to be worked out by Garfield, who was overwhelmed by the responsibility. He had to hold down 6,000 square miles of wilderness without railroads or telegraphs in the winter when the land simply couldn't support an army the size of the one he had. The countryside you're looking at right now, by the way, is the rough area that we're talking about. On January 10, 1862, the only battle in which Garfield personally commanded troops got underway. Fortunately, the commander of the pro-slavery army opposing him, Humphrey Marshall, wasn't exactly Napoleon. He was chosen for his political connections. A third of his men weren't fit for combat, and he didn't have any cavalry. Garfield, though, almost got clowned. He was outnumbered, some of the men under his command were poorly equipped, and another unit that he was supposed to link up with got lost in the mountains. Nevertheless, against the advice of his war council, Garfield ordered an advance. He tried to flank Marshall's camp with two groups that were not coordinated, meaning that if Marshall, if he knew what he was doing, could have defeated both of them individually and won the day. Fortunately, Garfield got some cavalry reinforcements at precisely the right moment, and he used them to fool the Confederates into thinking that they were being surrounded by a much larger force. Marshall retreated. A battle raged at Middle Creek for most of the afternoon. Another well-timed infusion of Union reinforcements caused the pro-slavery Confederates to retreat again. Union forces had effectively halted the Confederate invasion of Kentucky, but Garfield's good sense was augmented with at least as much good luck. Garfield retreated to Paintsville, Kentucky. Their actions that day were seen as a much-needed victory, both to the men and to the home front. Due to the loss of all civil authority in the state, Garfield was left to govern eastern Kentucky. The population was largely uneducated and white. While Kentucky state law required the stripping of citizenship of all Confederates, Garfield took a slightly more moderate stance. To those who have taken no part in this war, he said, who are in no way aiding or abetting the enemies of the Union, even to those who hold sentiments averse to the Union, but yet give no aid and comfort to his enemies, I offer the full protection of the government, both in their persons and property. End quote. Garfield publicly focused on the maintenance of the Union, but privately he maintained his evangelical and abolitionist zeal. He saw the war as divinely inspired and the Union as divinely led. Religion was always a big part of his thinking. Garfield was quickly promoted to brigadier general. Not long after, in early April 1862, he was drawn, sort of tangentially, into the incredibly bloody Battle of Shiloh in southwestern Tennessee. After Ulysses Grant's Union forces were surprise attacked, Garfield was ordered to bring his army to reinforce him. He and his men didn't arrive until it was almost over, after a Union counterattack drove back the pro-slavery armies with horrendous casualties. After hanging around in Tennessee for a couple of months, Garfield grew bored and frustrated. He criticized the West Point trained generals who were in higher commands and even suggested that they were involved in some sort of conspiracy to drag out the war and discredit the anti-slavery cause. He said, "My heart sinks down very low when I see the mode in which the war is conducted. Until the rebels are made to feel that rebellion is a crime which the government will punish, there is no hope of destroying it." End quote. During the court-martial of a Union colonel who sacked an Alabama town after the murder of one of his soldiers, exactly the kind of harsh tactic Garfield was advocating at the time, Garfield became sick with jaundice and diarrhea. He lost 40 pounds in less than a month. As soon as the trial ended, Garfield was sent back home to Ohio to convalesce. Garfield was slowly nursed back to health by his wife, and this was the first real privacy they shared since their marriage. Remember, most of their relationship had been conducted by letter up to this point. While Garfield was ill, the Republican nominating convention for the 19th District of Ohio, which had recently been redistricted to favor Republicans, occurred. Garfield didn't show up, though he carefully allowed his friends and political supporters to canvass for him behind the scenes and promote the idea of his candidacy in the papers. Kind of like the whole thing with the college presidency. Garfield sort of wanted to be elected congressman, but he didn't want to be seen taking a lot of personal effort to make that happen. Garfield was nominated at the convention and went on to be elected that fall, 1862. However, he was still in the Army, and the Congress to which he had been elected wasn't scheduled to convene until December 1863, more than a year away. Thus, for a year, he was both General Garfield, soldier, and Congressman-elect Garfield, Ohio politician. During this sort of gap year, Garfield secured an appointment as Chief of Staff to Union General William Rosecrans. The two of them got along famously, as Rosecrans was something of an intellectual too, kind of a rarity in the Union Army. The main military drama that Rosecrans was involved in concerned campaigns in Tennessee, particularly aimed at neutralizing the forces of Confederate General Braxton Bragg. Garfield was involved in a campaign called the Tullahoma Campaign that tried to trap Bragg and his forces so that he couldn't cause trouble for Grant, who was then besieging the key river port city of Vicksburg, Mississippi. The Tullahoma Campaign worked, but after Vicksburg was over, another campaign to terminate Bragg once and for all didn't go quite as well as expected. The Battle of Chickamauga in Tennessee was technically a Confederate victory, but Bragg lost a huge number of troops, and by this time, September 1863, the pro-slavery forces couldn't afford to suffer many more losses than they already had. During the Chickamauga campaign, Rosecrans was cautious in advancing. Garfield was the only one of his advisors who advocated an aggressive attack, echoing the orders coming from President Lincoln in Washington, which may have had a political calculus. Gee, you think? After the Union defeat at Chickamauga, General Grant replaced Rosecrans as commander of the Western armies, called the Army of the Cumberland, and that meant that his staff, including Garfield, was scattered to the winds. Garfield was pissed at Rosecrans anyway. There were rumors that he, Garfield, had pulled strings in Washington to get his boss reassigned, rumors that surfaced during the 1880 presidential campaign. He probably didn't sabotage Rosecrans's career, but a lot of Republicans eventually came to believe that he did. Garfield was headed to Washington, but he stopped off at home in Ohio first. On December 1st, 1863, just before he was scheduled to leave to take his congressional seat, his and Lucretia's 3-year-old daughter, Trot, died of some sort of fever. He arrived in Washington broken and grieving. Garfield had evidently expected the war would be over by the time he had to take his seat, and he was torn between serving in Congress or returning to the field as an army commander. Lincoln himself had to encourage Garfield to choose Congress. There were lots of army generals around, the president said, but a shortage of congressmen who could be counted on as allies of the White House. On December 5, 1863, Garfield resigned his commission in the Union Army. Garfield found the wartime Congress sort of a mess. Republicans were unified in prosecuting the war, but just about everybody was a critic of how Abraham Lincoln was running it. The Capitol itself was under extensive reconstruction, no pun intended. Garfield had no permanent home in Washington, renting rooms on C Street with another congressman named Robert Schenck. Issues involving conscription and financing the war effort took up much of Congress's time, and Lincoln's war policies were always controversial. Garfield wanted to take a hard line, confiscating the property of Confederate rebels, whom he judged had forfeited all constitutional rights as a result of taking part in the rebellion. Lincoln, in the meantime, counseled a more conciliatory approach. Ironically, considering that little pep talk Lincoln had given Garfield to convince him to serve in Congress rather than on the battlefield, during 1864, Garfield emerged as a significant congressional opponent of a lot of Lincoln's policies. Given this, it shouldn't surprise you that Garfield wasn't too hot on Lincoln's re-election in 1864, though in the end he realized there wasn't really a good alternative. During the 1864 Republican Convention, which Garfield attended, he was the spearhead of a movement to get the vice presidential nomination for his old boss, William Rosecrans. That didn't come to much, and the vice presidential nomination eventually went to a Democrat, Andrew Johnson, wartime governor of Tennessee. We'll be talking more about that. Garfield did not campaign for Lincoln. He didn't even really campaign much for himself, as his 19th Ohio district was a safe Republican stronghold. In fall 1864, Garfield was re-elected to another term in Congress, and Lincoln became the first U.S. president to be re-elected since Andrew Jackson in 1832. Not long after, when Garfield returned to Washington after some time home in Ohio, he brought his wife and family along this time. Lucretia had reminded him that of 3.5 years of marriage between the war and his congressional service, he'd been home with her for only 20 weeks. In early 1865, Congress passed the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery once and for all. Garfield enthusiastically supported it. The Civil War quickly wound down. Though Garfield could technically be hyped as a war hero and would be habitually referred to as General Garfield up until the time he started being called President Garfield, the war years were definitely a mixed bag for him. He wasn't exactly Ulysses Grant. He was just, well, James Garfield. His contribution to winning the Civil War was modest at best. That's okay, though. We can't all be Ulysses Grant. On the weekend that Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in April 1865, Congressman James Garfield was on a business trip to New York City, drumming up investors for a sale of stock in Pennsylvania oil fields. The news came the next morning that Lincoln, shot through the head by pro-slavery Confederate sympathizer John Wilkes Booth, was dead. In 1864, while running for re-election, Lincoln and the Republicans had made a political choice that was, after Lincoln's death, to have severe unintended consequences. Lincoln dumped his 1860 running mate, Hannibal Hamlin of Maine, and instead ran with former Tennessee Senator Andrew Johnson, technically a Democrat. Johnson had been the only member of Congress from a southern state who opposed secession, and for that reason, Republicans in 1864 thought he had some cachet on what they called a national unity ticket. Though he was not pro-Confederate and not really pro-slavery, Johnson's commitment to the program of Reconstruction, at least as Lincoln had envisioned it, was, let's say, lukewarm at best. Andrew Johnson was in fact a vicious racist who was allergic to the idea of African Americans achieving full citizenship, and especially voting. From April 1865, when he took office upon Lincoln's death, to December, when Congress reconvened, Johnson had a free hand to shape policies toward the defeated South as he saw fit. Most of those policies involved lenience toward former Confederates and the restoration of white rule in the southern states. This was totally opposed to the views of many congressional Republicans, including James Garfield, who was lumped together with what is usually called the radical Republicans. Though pretty much from the end of the war on, Garfield's so-called radicalism continually dimmed. Curiously, though, despite his siding with the radical Republicans at least some of the time, Garfield gained fame in this period as a lawyer, arguing against one of the Lincoln administration's most consequential measures. Despite never having tried a case before, Garfield was technically law partners with Jeremiah Black, whose law firm had taken the case of a guy named Lambden Milligan. Now, Milligan was a copperhead, what they were known as copperheads. He opposed the Civil War, and he and several others who spoke out publicly against the war were hauled before a military tribunal in Indiana, accused of aiding the enemy. Civilian courts in Indiana were not closed down. The legal issue in this case was whether it was constitutional to try Milligan and the others before military court, where normal civilian courts were still operating. In late February 1866, Jeremiah Black asked Garfield if he'd come into the case and help argue it. On March 5, 1866, he did, arguing in this room, the Second Supreme Court chamber in the Capitol. A couple of weeks later, the court held in favor of Milligan, ruling that military tribunals did violate the Constitution in this circumstance. Garfield, never much of a lawyer before this, except on paper, had suddenly won his very first case, in front of the Supreme Court, no less. Ironically, he took the case in part hoping to get paid, but Milligan never paid his legal bill. In politics, Garfield was less interested in Reconstruction policies than he was fiscal and financial ones. He was a firm believer in what was called hard money. During the Civil War, to finance the enormously expensive conflict, the federal government had issued almost $500 billion in paper money called greenbacks, money which was not backed by gold. Many of these greenbacks were still circulating in the years after the war. Garfield had a burr up his bum about this, firmly believing throughout his career that the government should redeem those paper dollars by paying off their holders in silver or gold, specie payments, they were usually called. Now, I know this sounds really dull, and it is, but if Garfield ever had a political principle that he never wavered from, this kind of fiscal conservatism was it. With regard to a similar issue, Garfield opposed tariffs that put high taxes on imported goods as a way to raise revenue and stimulate business growth. Most Republicans in 1866 favored tariffs. Garfield didn't. Garfield won his 1866 election handily. By contrast, President Andrew Johnson wasn't doing so well. During 1866, he embarked on a doomed speaking tour called Swing Round the Circle, pushing his views on Reconstruction at various grassroots events. It backfired badly. In the 1866 elections, Republicans gained a 2/3 majority in both houses, meaning a veto-proof supermajority. Johnson was doomed. During 1867, sentiment against Johnson built steadily, and when the new Congress convened later in the year, there was bound to be a clash. While this would inure to Garfield's benefit since he was associated with opposition to the president, Garfield's position on money issues did hurt him, as the Republican leadership passed him over for membership on the powerful Ways and Means Committee, which Garfield very much wanted to be chairman of. There were two moves toward impeachment of Johnson. The first, begun in early 1867, came to a vote in December. The House Judiciary Committee had not made a strong case, charging Johnson with rather vague allegations of abuse of power. Garfield was instrumental in convincing his colleagues to vote down the impeachment charges. It wasn't because he had any love for Johnson, far from it. But Garfield thought it wouldn't pass and that it would harm the opposition. Furthermore, the political calculus had changed a bit. Off-year elections in 1867, including in Ohio, had brought some gains for Democrats, who were finally starting to rally around the issue of denying African Americans the right to vote. But in February 1868, Johnson violated an act that Congress had recently passed as sort of a trap for him. This was the Tenure of Office Act that held any official that required Senate approval to take office also required the consent of the Senate to remove him from office. Johnson tried to fire Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. He contended, probably correctly, that the Tenure of Office Act was unconstitutional. Garfield, for the record, had voted in favor of the act, so in early 1868, armed with new ammunition, congressional Republicans mounted another impeachment drive. This time, Garfield supported it. He thought the tenure of office thing changed the game. Now, he wasn't sure that this move would work either, but at the end of May 1868, when the Senate fell one vote short of removing Johnson from office, Garfield was outraged. He blamed Salmon Chase, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, whom he thought had influenced senators to let Johnson off easy. This cost Garfield his long friendship with Chase. By summer 1868, it was time to gear up for another House campaign. Ulysses Grant, military hero of the Union Army, was on the Republican ticket, and with Johnson politically crippled, the Democrats were having a hard time finding anyone who even wanted to run. New York Governor Horatio Seymour ultimately accepted the challenge with extreme reluctance. The Republican platform had come out in favor of hard money, as opposed to printing more greenbacks, as the Democrats wanted to do. Since this coincided with Garfield's own strongly held positions, this is what he ran on in 1868. His opponents were pretty desperate for issues to use against him. Political opponents in Ohio charged that Garfield was corrupt, that he philandered with prostitutes, or that he'd secretly gone to England to get cured of some disease, the implication being that it was sexually transmitted. None of this was true. And in the end, it didn't matter. He was easily renominated as congressman for the 19th Ohio District, and then easily won re-election in the fall. Grant was, as was expected, overwhelmingly elected president. Something else happened at the end of 1868, between the time Grant was elected and when he took office, that was to have a big effect on Garfield's career. Garfield was approached by another congressman, Oakes Ames of Massachusetts. In addition to being a serving congressman, Ames was instrumental in marshaling capital for the Union Pacific Railroad, one of the two main railroad companies that were then in the final stages of completing the Transcontinental Railroad. The corporate vehicle that Ames used to do this was called Credit Mobilier of America. In late 1868, Ames offered to sell Garfield 10 shares of Credit Mobilier for $1,000, about $23,000 in today's money. Garfield said he would think about it. In the meantime, while he was thinking about taking the stock, he accepted $329 from Ames, which he characterized as a loan. It turned out later, but would not be publicly known for 3 more years, that Ames was offering lots of congressmen stock in Credit Mobilier for far below market value. It was a scam to get rich by inflating the cost of building the railroad and distributing the excess to a few carefully chosen fat cats. Garfield was at least under consideration by Ames for being one of those fat cats, pun intended. So remember this, it becomes important later. In March 1869, the hated Andrew Johnson moved out of the White House, refusing even to attend the inauguration of his successor. Ulysses Grant was the youngest president ever elected up until that time. Though he and Garfield's party were ascendant in American politics, a quite tumultuous era in Garfield's life and career was only just beginning. We get to that in the next chapter. It's impossible to go through all the twists and turns of James Garfield's professional career during the 8 years that Grant was president, between 1869 and 77, which was precisely the period that Garfield started to attain the stature that would eventually get him elected president. I'll hit the highlights here, but I'm necessarily leaving a lot out. But this period of Republican congressional politics, basically the 1870s, was dominated by 2 personalities who played immensely important roles in Garfield's career, and Grant was not one of them. Let's start with James G. Blaine. Apparently you never left out the G. Though born in Pennsylvania, and for a time a resident of Kentucky, Blaine eventually settled and got into politics in the state of Maine during the 1850s, as the Republican Party was getting organized. He was a delegate, for example, to the very first Republican National Convention, at least the presidential convention, which nominated John C. Fremont for president in 1856. After serving in the Maine House of Representatives in 1862, Blaine was elected to the U.S. House in the class of freshman congressmen that included Garfield. Like Garfield, Blaine generally supported the radical Republicans on Reconstruction issues. Also like Garfield, he was a fiscal conservative and didn't like those greenbacks floating around out there in the economy. On March 4, 1869, the same day as Grant took office as U.S. president, Blaine was elected Speaker of the House of Representatives. Blaine had a problem, though, and an intractable enemy, Roscoe Conkling of New York, the other of the major personalities that dominated congressional politics in this period. First elected to the U.S. House in 1858, Conkling was an accomplished practitioner of what's known as the spoils system, elevated to an art by President Andrew Jackson in the 1830s, basically rewarding one's friends with cushy jobs once getting elected. In the spring of 1866, Congress was debating a bill to reorganize the military, much needed now that the fighting was over. Conkling wanted to eliminate, by striking out a provision of this bill, the office of Provost Marshal General, then held by a man named James Barnett Frye. He ran the draft, which during the Civil War was widely hated, and had a part in triggering the infamous New York City draft riots of July 1863. Conkling believed Frye to be corrupt, an instance of the pot calling the kettle black, and sought to eliminate his office as a means of getting him out of the military. Though James G. Blaine had no particular reason to defend General Frye, he wasn't a huge fan of Conkling to begin with. And on April 30th, 1866, he and Conkling got into a back and forth on the floor of the House over this provision and over Frye's general character. Things got heated. Blaine and Conkling each impugned the other's integrity and honesty. The row over General Frye eventually became a grudge that each man held against the other, personally and politically. Anyway, back to Garfield. In September 1869, two Wall Street pirates, Jay Gould and Jim Fisk, tried to corner the New York gold market by leveraging a relationship with Abel Corbin, President Grant's brother-in-law. The pirates figured they could use Corbin to influence Grant's decisions on monetary policy. Yes, this had to do with those pesky greenbacks. Grant had been elected in part on a platform to redeem those and government bonds in gold. Gould and Fisk figured that if they knew what Grant and the Treasury was going to do day to day about gold, they could use that information to corner the market. It blew up in their faces, of course. On September 24th, 1869, a Friday, there was a panic on the floor of the gold exchange. Gould and Fisk almost got rich, but Grant got wind of what was going on and ordered the government to sell $4 million in gold immediately. This cratered the scheme, but the financial damage throughout the U.S. economy, which was extremely fragile in 1869, was considerable. Garfield was one of the congressional investigators who looked into the panic that came to be called Black Friday. Garfield was very thorough, too thorough it turned out for President Grant, who resented him snooping around his wife and her family. Recall, the whole gold thing started with Grant's brother-in-law. While Garfield found out that Grant himself hadn't committed any wrongdoing, he used it as a way to flog his favorite issue, getting those damn greenbacks out of the economy and returning to the gold standard. Garfield's expertise on government finance eventually got him appointed as chair of the House Appropriations Committee, though not the Ways and Means Committee, which was what he really wanted. Garfield's views on money and tariffs eventually put him on the enemies list of an influential New York City newspaper editor, one Horace Greeley, who was a main character in my election of 1872 video. As you know from watching that video, a splinter faction of Republicans who generally viewed Grant and his administration as hopelessly corrupt convened their own convention to nominate an alternative candidate. That candidate was Horace Greeley. The Democrats who were moribund in 1872 decided to not even bother to field a candidate of their own, and they nominated Greeley, a Republican. Grant didn't have much chance of losing, but Garfield wasn't too enthusiastic about campaigning for him, although he hated the alternative, Greeley, even worse. But in September 1872, about 2 months before the election, another New York paper, not Greeley's, started running an expose on the affairs of that railroad finance company, Credit Mobilier. Correspondence with Oakes Ames disclosed that the Credit Mobilier guys were trying to bribe congressmen for favorable legislation for the railroad. So yeah, remember that stock that Congressman Ames had offered Garfield back in 1868? Garfield didn't take the stock, but he did take $329 from Oakes Ames. Was it a loan, or was it a dividend from the Credit Mobilier preferred stock that Garfield kinda, but not really, didn't own. No one was sure, and historians today still aren't sure. Greeley couldn't make hay out of the Credit Mobilier scandal. In any event, Grant reduced Greeley to a smoking cinder at the polls, after which Greeley promptly died, before all the electoral votes were counted and certified. Garfield was re-elected too. His Ohio district was quite safe, but in January 1873 he found himself hauled before a congressional committee, the Poland Committee, investigating Credit Mobilier. The testimony was contradictory. Garfield said he never took the stock. Ames said it was a year before he refused it. Garfield said that $329 was a loan. Ames said it was a dividend. The Poland Committee chose to believe Ames, in part because Garfield refused to come back to testify to answer the charges, saying that it was beneath him. As soon as this controversy died down, Garfield stepped in poo again, this time with an act which came out of his committee, the Committee on Appropriations, greatly increasing the salaries of government officials, including the President, Supreme Court justices, and members of Congress. The bugaboo for this bill was that it was retroactive to 1871, which meant the congressmen who voted for it, many of whom had been defeated for re-election, would get a big payday on their way out of office. Generally, the American public hates it when Congress raises its own salary, as if most members of Congress weren't already independently wealthy. For the record, Garfield was not. He didn't like the bill, but he realized it was necessary. It passed in March 1873, and the country went nuts. What the papers termed the salary grab, which had Garfield's fingerprints all over it, contributed to a political disaster in the 1874 elections. So did the financial collapse, usually called the Panic of 1873, which resulted in part from the collapse of what you might call the railroad bubble. Too much public and private money had been sunk into railroads, which by 1873 were vastly overbuilt and earning back only a fraction of their cost. Then there was another scandal involving a company called the DeGoyler-McClelland Pavement Company. Now I'm just going to skip right over that, but suffice it to say, Garfield was accused of taking money to steer a cushy government contract toward this particular company. If you wonder why Garfield kept stepping on these rakes, it's because he wasn't independently wealthy, which I said a moment ago. He occasionally fell for get-rich-quick schemes. That Pennsylvania oil lands thing that he was working on at the time of Lincoln's assassination, that was one of those. Anyway, due to Credit Mobilier, the salary grab, the DeGoyler thing, Garfield found 1874 the hardest of his congressional elections. He defended himself, and he even returned the money he personally got from the salary grab. He did win because, of course, as you recall, his district was pretty safe, but Republicans generally got hosed in these elections. Democrats flipped the House of Representatives for the first time since before the Civil War. The Senate remained a Republican majority. Because he was no longer in the majority party in the House, Garfield lost his position as chair of the House Appropriations Committee for the new Congress that took office in the fall of 1875. Suffice it to say, with as crappy as the Republicans' performance had been lately, as 1876 approached, Democrats finally saw an opening to win their first presidential election in 20 years. And the field of likely Republican nominees was surprisingly weak. Grant, who kinda wanted a third term, though preferably not now because his name was mud in many quarters, anyway, he took himself out of the running in late 1875. Going into the convention in mid-June 1876, the strongest candidate seemed to be James G. Blaine. Remember him? Also in the mix of potential candidates, there were a lot of them, was Blaine's arch-enemy, Roscoe Conkling. Although Blaine polled a plurality of the delegates' votes on the first ballot of the convention, many Republicans didn't think he could win the general election. So, they nominated a dark horse, Rutherford B. Hayes, governor of Ohio, whom Garfield, of course, knew and generally liked, at least at first. The Democrats nominated Samuel Tilden, who, like their doomed 1868 nominee Horatio Seymour, was governor of New York. When the vote came in the fall, there was a tremendous amount of fraud, violence, and chicanery regarding voter suppression and ballot stuffing. There were problems in numerous places, but most notably in several southern states, especially Louisiana, South Carolina, and Florida, where, among other things, white supremacist terrorists intimidated and even killed African American voters, almost all of whom wanted to vote Republican. Eventually, those three states sent in two competing sets of electoral votes, one set for Hayes, the Republican, the other for Tilden, the Democrat. Additionally, one electoral vote from Oregon was uncertain due to a dispute over the qualifications of one of the electors. Tilden, who got 184 electoral votes without the disputed votes, needed only one more to win. Hayes was at 165, but if and only if all of those disputed votes were counted for Hayes, he could still win, despite having lost the popular vote by 250,000 and 2 percentage points. All over the country, passions over the disputed election were running so high that many feared the Civil War would start up all over again. Garfield himself had been reelected easily, but he took no joy in the victory. Just after the election, his youngest son, Edward, called Neddy, only 2 years old, caught a fever. A couple of days later, he died, the second of the Garfield's children to die. Not long after that, the messy results of the election started to come in. In early 1877, congressional Democrats floated a plan to create a special electoral commission to sort out the mess. Garfield, fearing it would be stacked with Tilden supporters, vehemently opposed it, but he was undercut by none other than Roscoe Conkling, who led President Grant's allies in Congress and who apparently wanted the commission for whatever reason. Despite voting against the establishment of the commission, Garfield was one of the 15 men who was elected to serve on it, congressmen, senators, and Supreme Court justices. It was supposed to be evenly balanced among Republicans and Democrats, with political independent David Davis, a Supreme Court justice, being the swing vote. But Davis resigned from the commission to serve as senator from Illinois, an office the Illinois state legislature may have voted him as sort of a bribe, or possibly to get him out of the way. Davis's replacement was another Supreme Court justice, Joseph Bradley, who leaned Republican. Beginning on January 31st, 1877, the Electoral Commission, including Garfield, met in this room, which is the former Supreme Court chamber in the Capitol. For weeks, they hashed over the controversy, hearing arguments, deliberating, and taking votes. When it got dark, they worked by candlelight, because gas jets hadn't been installed in this part of the Capitol. The commission voted predictably 8-7 to give every electoral vote to Hayes. Even after their decision, it wasn't over, as House Democrats tried to filibuster the final counting of electoral votes. Now, at last, it came down to a political deal. Garfield was apparently not present when the deal was made. On February 26, 1877, he was summoned to a meeting at this hotel in Washington called Wormley's Hotel, where Hayes's cronies were meeting with various Southern Democrats. Garfield had the impression that a deal had already been made. He was being sounded out as to whether he'd block it. He didn't. Whether there really was a deal is one of the big controversies of American history. The evidence suggests there was. Withdrawal of federal troops from the remaining occupied southern states in exchange for Southern Democrats not raising a further stink about Hayes's election. What this meant, in effect, was abandoning African American voters in the South to white supremacy and getting the federal government out of the business of guaranteeing their voting rights. Even if there was no official deal made at Wormley's Hotel or elsewhere, this was certainly the effect. Reconstruction was over. The voting rights and political power of African Americans was sacrificed for the next 90 years to secure a temporary political peace among white politicians. After the deal was made, whoever was in on it, the would-be filibusterers in the House eventually lost steam. At 4:15 a.m. on March 1st, 1877, Congress counted 185 electoral votes for Rutherford Hayes. A few days later, Hayes took the oath of office. Would Garfield have a place in the new administration? Find out in the next chapter. Garfield, who by 1877 had been in Congress 15 years, wanted to become a senator. But as we've seen, he was always reluctant to work very hard for the offices he wanted, preferring that they be handed to him on a silver platter. Anyway, because there was so much controversy over the 1876 election, and Hayes was only confirmed a few days before he took office, there wasn't the usual time for a president-elect to make cabinet appointments. Hayes appointed John Sherman, senator from Ohio, to be Secretary of the Treasury. Sherman, who also figures heavily later in our story, was the younger brother of Civil War General William Tecumseh Sherman, who was uninterested in politics. With Sherman going to the Treasury Department, there would be an Ohio Senate seat vacant. Garfield wanted it, but due to a blunder or two and some crossed wires, and especially a suggestion from the new President Hayes that Garfield stand down for senator in hopes of getting a better post later, he missed out on it. This comedy of errors soured the relationship between Garfield and the new president. He was pissed, but he grew even more so over the next few months as his suggestions for various government positions, usually Ohio political allies, were refused by Hayes and his administration. Garfield proved unable to influence even a single appointment, despite the fact that under the customs of political patronage that existed in the late 1870s, he should have been one of the main guys that Hayes was listening to and trying to placate. This gets us into the whole issue of civil service reform, which, as we'll see, was one of the main issues of the 1880 campaign and of Garfield's eventual presidency. This is a complicated topic, and one worth spending a bit of time on. In the 19th century, it was common practice for political party leaders, when they won elections, to reward supporters and friends with jobs in the government. While this had been done quietly since the beginning of the Republic, it didn't really emerge as an issue until the presidency of Andrew Jackson. Since the time of Thomas Jefferson, the United States, at least the federal government, had been essentially a one-party state. Almost all the people in political office were Democratic Republicans, the party of Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, and even technically John Quincy Adams. Jackson, however, represented a new realignment of the new Democratic Party. When he came into office in 1829, it really was a new regime. Jackson unabashedly rewarded his supporters with political jobs, and he gets most of the credit for introducing what's called the spoils system. After 1829, a major feature of the federal government, especially the presidency, involved doling out jobs to members of the ruling party. And both parties, Democrats and Whigs up until the 1850s, and Democrats and Republicans after that, both of them did it. Reforming this practice was a major focus of the critics of President Grant, including those who split off into the short-lived Liberal Republican Party in 1872 that nominated Horace Greeley. Garfield was a reformer, but perhaps for not the reasons that you might think. He wasn't opposed to the spoils system on moral or ethical grounds. He wanted to reform it because it had become unworkable in practice. Whenever a new president took office, or any politician really, he was mobbed with people begging him for jobs. There were far more beggars than there were jobs to give them, and huge amounts of politicians' time was sucked away dealing with these people. People wanted those jobs because they could make a lot of money at them, and not just from the salary. The biggest and most profitable political job in post-Civil War America was the collector of the Port of New York. This was an official whose job was to collect tariffs from foreign goods imported into the United States. Since New York was the biggest American port that did business overseas, more money came into the country this way than into any other port. And in the days before income taxes, at least before they were widespread, customs fees were the major source of revenue for the federal government. So, collector of the Port of New York was an important job, and lucrative, not just because of the salary, but because the collector could skim a percentage of the value of cargoes seized or fines paid by smugglers who got caught trying to evade the customs taxes. Collector of the Port of New York was also a job largely controlled by the political boss of New York, or at least most of it. In the 1870s, that person was Roscoe Conkling. To be sure, as a corrupt political machine, Conkling did have competition in the form of the infamous Tammany Hall. But though collector of the Port of New York was a job nominated by the president and confirmed by the Senate, no one would get the job without Conkling's permission. And in fact, nomination and appointment were essentially rubber stamps on whoever Conkling wanted for that position. In 1871, the man Conkling wanted was sort of his protege, a dapper fellow with ludicrous sideburns called Chester Arthur. President Grant grumbled a bit, but appointed him. Arthur went right to work, soon amassing a personal fortune, a lot of fine clothes, crystal chandeliers, and other nice trappings befitting a Gilded Age gentleman. In 1877, President Hayes, who did oppose the spoils system on moral and ethical grounds, started a major wave of reform to fulfill campaign promises. He went into the Customs House with guns blazing, rhetorically speaking. He tried to fire Arthur and several other men who were generally regarded as corrupt. But, characteristically for Hayes, he botched it. The Senate, most of whose members rather liked the spoils system, refused to confirm the replacements that Hayes nominated. Nevertheless, as soon as Congress adjourned in July 1878, Hayes fired Arthur, earning the eternal hostility of his patron, Roscoe Conkling. Basically, as president, Hayes pissed off everybody. Democrats hated him because of the way he got into office, even notwithstanding the deal that he made to do so, which granted most of the Democrats' fondest wishes, at least on racial policy. Republicans hated Hayes because he was trying to take away the chief means of them staying in office, which was rewarding supporters with political spoils. Hayes also didn't respond much to public opinion. He was cold, aloof, and seemed detached from everything. He wasn't popular with the public. Another recession, this one even worse this time, began in 1877, shortly after he took office. Labor unrest, especially in the railroad industry, swept the country. Conflict with Native Americans had ramped up on the frontier. In short, America in the Rutherford Hayes years was pretty much a mess. Hayes wasn't planning to run again in 1880, but even if he had, probably nobody except his wife would have voted for him anyway. Oh wait, women couldn't vote in 1880, so he wouldn't have even had her vote. Garfield was not thinking about running for president, at least not seriously. But as the excruciating Hayes years neared their end, he was hoping that his political fortunes would take a tick upward in 1880. Specifically, it seemed like his time had finally come to be elected senator. Ohio's other senator, Allan Thurman, was a Democrat, but his term was expiring in 1880. If Ohio's Senate chamber flipped back to Republican-controlled, Garfield was the natural choice to succeed him, and this time, Hayes couldn't spoil it. Things were good for James Garfield in this period. He was one of the most respected men in Congress, despite the scandals of the earlier 1870s. He'd finally been able to buy a house for his family in Ohio. He still wasn't rich, the house was heavily mortgaged, but at least he and his large family could live reasonably comfortably. You're looking at the house now on Google Maps. The Garfields didn't name it, but the press during the 1880 campaign would eventually come to call it Lawnfield, and the name has stuck. Garfield bought it shortly after the death of his son Neddy in 1876. By the end of the Hayes years, it was a happy place. Legislatively, Garfield helped Congress hold the line against obnoxious legislation from Southern Democrats by sustaining several vetoes of such bills issued by President Hayes. The papers modestly began to talk of Garfield as a potential presidential prospect in 1880. As I said earlier, though, Garfield was more interested in the Senate chamber than the White House. In 1879, there were off-year elections in the state of Ohio to elect state senators. Garfield campaigned heavily for the Republican candidates, hoping they would return the favor and eventually elect him senator. It worked. The Senate chamber did flip to Republicans as a result of those elections. Now he had to make sure that all the prominent Ohio Republicans were in line. For that, Garfield needed the support, or at least not the opposition, of John Sherman, the Treasury Secretary. Sherman planned to run for president in 1880. While Garfield moved carefully to avoid violating his policy that he could never be seen publicly angling for higher office, he and Sherman reached an understanding. If Garfield supported Sherman for president in 1880, Sherman would let it be known that he was very happy with the idea of James A. Garfield as Ohio's next senator. This worked too. On January 6, 1880, the Ohio Senate Republican nominating caucus met and selected Garfield by acclamation as their nominee and as the next Ohio senator. This would be the first political office since Garfield had since 1862 that was not congressman from the 19th District. He had the prize he wanted, but now he was pledged to support Sherman's bid for president. In fact, it would be more than that. Once selected as a delegate to the Republican National Convention in June, Garfield would be the leader of Sherman's campaign forces at the convention. His job at the convention, in exchange for Sherman's support, making him senator, was to get Sherman the nomination for president. I don't think it's a spoiler to tell you that that is not what happened. Exactly how things went so differently and why is the subject of the next chapter. The problem with the 1880 Republican National Convention and the circumstance that ultimately made Garfield the nominee can be summarized in one word and one picture, which you're looking at now: Grant. In the 19th century, U.S. presidents were not term limited. The 22nd Amendment would not be passed until 1951. But there was a long tradition established by George Washington in 1796 that a president should not serve more than 2 terms. But as a practical matter, the strength of that informal limitation had never really been tested. The last president before Grant who served 2 full terms was Andrew Jackson. But when his time was up in 1837, he was so old, frail, and sick that he couldn't walk much of the time. So a 3rd term was never really consideration. Grant himself, as you recall, declined a 3rd term at the end of 1875, largely because his administration was mired in scandal and he was personally somewhat tired of the office. After 4 years out of power, though, he decided he wanted more. The political climate had changed, and with the major disappointment that Hayes had been, Grant thought the winds favored him. But his potential candidacy further hardened the 2 intractable camps that had developed in the Republican Party by the beginning of 1880. Grant's supporters were by 1880 known as stalwarts. They not only wanted the cigar-chomping, whiskey-guzzling field marshal back in the White House, but they wanted to continue to do things the old way politically, which meant a hostility to the various radical ideas of reforming the civil service and abolishing the old spoils system. Guess who was the strongest, most vocal, most psychotically sycophantic fanboy to Stalwart and the Grant cause going into the 1880 convention? Roscoe Conkling, naturally. The other faction was known as the half-breeds. Though nobody liked President Hayes anymore, they were generally much friendlier to the causes that he said he stood for, mainly civil service reform. You can see where this is going. Guess who was the leader of the half-breed faction at the convention? No, not Garfield. It was Conkling's arch-enemy, James G. Blaine. The fact that Garfield was pledged for Sherman didn't dampen the generally cordial political alliance that Blaine and Garfield had. Sherman was, for the record, a half-breed, but in the pecking order of candidates, he was generally thought of as significantly behind Blaine. Now, to be sure, I don't want to give you the impression that Garfield totally never wanted or never thought about being elected President of the United States. In fact, there is some evidence that he did want to be president. In fact, the public letter that Garfield wrote in January 1880, talking up Sherman for president, was thought to be strangely equivocal and not as enthusiastic as Sherman probably expected. The convention was to be held at the fairly new Interstate Industrial Exposition Building in Chicago. The convention was part of Chicago's Renaissance after the Great Fire of 1871. The new exposition hall had been built in 1873 with both World's Fair-type events and political conventions in mind. Garfield and most of the Republican dignitaries were staying at the newly built Grand Pacific Hotel on Clark Street, but rooms were in short supply. In fact, after the first day of the convention, Garfield was about to go to bed when a delegate, pounded on his hotel room and begged Garfield to let him sleep in his room because no other accommodations were available. Politically, the key to the strategy by Conkling and the stalwarts to nominate Grant was what was called the unit rule. This concept came up in my video on the election of 1924, specifically on the Democratic side. The idea was that each state delegation would take a vote internally, and if the unit rule applied, all delegates from that state would be forced to vote the way the majority of the delegates wanted to vote. So, for example, just making the numbers up, if Delaware had 10 delegates and 6 wanted to vote for Grant and 4 wanted to vote for Blaine, if the unit rule applied at the convention as a whole, Delaware would cast all 10 votes for Grant. Don't ask me what would have happened if there was a tie. Also, to be nominated, a candidate had to get a majority, not a plurality, of the delegate votes cast. There were 755 delegates, so the magic number was 379. The stalwarts went into the convention with about 305 votes for Grant that they thought they could count on. If the unit rule applied, they could easily vacuum up the 70-odd votes they needed to get over the top, principally among the delegations of Illinois, Pennsylvania, and New York, who had majorities of delegates that supported Grant, but sizable minorities who didn't. Because of this fairly simple math, you can see that the unit rule was the major issue at the convention. It was life or death to the stalwarts. And if you wanted anyone else other than Grant to be nominated, you had to defeat this rule. Their plan was this. Donald Cameron would be temporary chairman of the convention when it convened. Cameron, son of James Cameron, the film director, Simon Cameron, longtime Republican politician who had served in Lincoln's cabinet. Anyway, he was supposed to invoke the unit rule on the first vote to organize the convention. That was it. That was the whole game. With the unit rule in place, Grant would probably claim victory on the first ballot, or at least be close enough to persuade a few dissenting delegates to rally behind him. Other Republicans, though, got wind of this scheme and they cried bloody murder. In a series of contentious meetings before the first day of the convention, various members of the National Committee, which did not include Garfield, organized to defeat the unit rule and Cameron. Instead of him, they supported, for chairman of the convention, George Frisbee Hoar, senator from Massachusetts, who made an appearance in my 1872 video. His last name was spelled Hoar. Because this video will probably be demonetized if I say his last name too often, I'm going to call him by his much more fun middle name, Frisbee. On the first day of the convention, Cameron called the meeting to order, but he was quickly replaced as chair by Senator Frisbee. On the morning of the convention's second day, June 4th, 1880, Roscoe Conkling proposed as his first order of business, adopting a rule that all delegates would have to pledge to support the eventual nominee, whoever that was. This was not quite the unit rule, which was dead with Frisbee as convention chair, but it was still kind of a bullying tactic. Nevertheless, the convention voted 716-3 in favor of this loyalty oath rule. The 3 dissenters were all delegates from the same state, West Virginia. Conkling was outraged. He made a motion that those 3 West Virginians be expelled from the convention. This proved to be Garfield's opening. Several of his supporters urged him to speak up, which he was probably going to do anyway. Frisbee recognized him and he began, "I fear this convention is about to make a mistake." He spoke for several minutes on the question, upholding the right of convention delegates to vote their consciences, a veiled attack on the whole unit rule plan. Garfield's speech received uproarious applause. Many delegates believed the stalwarts had been too heavy-handed from the beginning, and with the obvious enthusiasm for what Garfield had said, Conkling decided it was unwise to push it. He withdrew his loyalty oath proposal, which, as you recall, had received 99.6% of the convention's votes just a few minutes before. This was the turning point of the 1880 Republican Convention. Several more fights followed over rules, over delegate credentials, and naturally over the balloting. But from the moment that Garfield spoke up for those 3 West Virginians, the momentum was shifting away from Grant. But because the half-breeds were supporting a scattering of delegates, including Blaine and Sherman, they didn't have the power to push any one of them over the top, unless they all united behind one guy. The highest Grant ever got was 313 votes on the 35th ballot. The highest Blaine ever got was 285 votes on the 13th and 14th ballots. Grant still had the edge, but not any real chance of getting to the magic number, 379. Garfield again was not publicly trying to steer the convention toward himself. In fact, he gave his scheduled speech placing John Sherman's name in nomination. But even while he was doing that, someone interrupted him to shout, "We want Garfield." After marathon meetings at the Grand Pacific Hotel among the half-breed forces, during which each of Blaine and Sherman demanded that the other surrender to him, it was clear that the only thing that would prevent the convention from cratering entirely was for the anti-Grant forces to get behind someone not named Blaine or Sherman. Garfield, given his prominence at the convention, was the obvious choice. On the 34th ballot, after a tepid attempt to float Elihu Washburn as the savior of America failed to catch fire, can't imagine why, the Wisconsin delegation, the last one polled in alphabetical order, Wyoming wasn't a state yet, suddenly cast 16 votes for Garfield. The floor went wild. Garfield even tried to protest, since he had not authorized them to vote for him, but Senator Frisbee ruled him out of order. On the next ballot, the 35th, Garfield polled 50 votes, and the momentum was on. Senator John Sherman, who was the candidate Garfield was pledged to support, quickly sent a telegram to the Ohio delegation and told them to vote for Garfield on the next ballot. The Grant forces still wouldn't yield. On the convention's final ballot, 306 delegates stubbornly stuck to him, but Garfield received 399 votes on the 36th and final ballot. He got to the magic number. America, meet your Republican nominee for president, James Abram Garfield. Was it really a fluke, a dark horse nomination? I mean, Garfield had to be manipulating things behind the scenes, right? There was some kind of master plan that went off flawlessly, right? Well, no. While it would be inaccurate to say that Garfield was chosen in spite of his own efforts, he did, after all, have some presidential ambitions, he really wasn't working very hard behind the scenes for the nomination, but rather putting himself in the right place at the right time in a very skillful and subtle way. The best analogy about how to think of this, which comes from Allan Peskin's biography of Garfield, a major source I use for this video, is this. Garfield getting nominated in Chicago in 1880 was pretty much the equivalent of getting struck by lightning. However, Garfield noticed there was a thunderstorm and essentially ran out into the middle of an open field holding a lightning rod. Having nominated Garfield, the convention had one more important item to take care of, the vice presidential nomination. It was pretty straightforward due to the political calculus. Coming out of the convention, essentially divided, the Republican ticket would have no hope of winning unless the stalwarts were supporting it. The biggest stalwart coalition was in New York, a state they absolutely needed to win. Roscoe Conkling was furious that his candidate Grant had been passed over. He was basically sulking back at his hotel. After some dithering and an attempt to interest New York banker Levi Morton in the vice presidential nomination, the New York delegation decided on none other than Chester Arthur, the former New York customs official who had been fired by President Hayes, and who in much of the country was the poster boy for political corruption and the spoils system. Garfield had no input in the decision whatsoever. Arthur had been active earlier in the convention, trying to broker compromises between the various factions. Surprisingly, Conkling originally tried to talk Arthur out of it. He wanted no cooperation at all with the Garfield ticket, but Arthur was adamant that he would accept. With the convention over, Garfield returned home to Ohio, somewhat bewildered and overwhelmed. Because he'd been nominated so unexpectedly, he had no campaign organization, no war chest, no army of volunteers. Now he had to put together a national political campaign on the fly, something few presidential candidates had ever done before. How he did it and how he managed to win despite these disadvantages is the subject of the next chapter. The challenges Garfield faced in the 1880 presidential election were pretty formidable. As I said a moment ago, when he came out of the convention, he had no organization and no strategy. The party was full of big dogs like Conkling, Grant, and even Blaine, who were disappointed at how things went in Chicago and somewhat reluctant to campaign for Garfield. Furthermore, what kind of message were they sending anyway? Garfield was known for his civil service reform positions, and he was on the ticket with the poster boy for the spoils system, and as most people saw Arthur, the radio-controlled bot of the Conkling machine. What were Americans voting for if they pulled the lever for Garfield? To a certain extent, this was not Garfield's problem. In the 19th century, presidential candidates were supposed to stay home, make a few speeches, write some letters, and generally look presidential, while campaign operatives and subordinates actually went out there to canvass voters and drum up support. Indeed, Garfield returned to his home in Ohio, Lawnfield, and while he did write the customary letter accepting the nomination and saying some very patriotic and inspirational things, he conducted a standard issue by the book 19th Century Front Porch Presidential Campaign. The real work was done behind the scenes by political hacks, especially a man called Stephen Dorsey, the secretary of the Republican National Committee. Note, the secretary, not the chairman. Despite being a subordinate, Dorsey was eager to run the 1880 campaign, whether he was supposed to be running it or not. Dorsey was responsible for the most significant thing that Garfield ended up doing during the campaign. Recognizing that having New York on board and that Conkling wasn't satisfied with just having Arthur on the ticket, Dorsey, acting on his own, sent out a bunch of invitations to prominent Republicans to meet Garfield at the Fifth Avenue Hotel in New York City. This would be a summit meeting, essentially, where Garfield would be forced to ask Conkling the big question: what will it take to get you to help the ticket? The Fifth Avenue Hotel was a swank address in the city. The Grants, for example, had stayed there numerous times and would again after the 1880 campaign. A building called the Toy Center is now on the same site. By the summer of 1880, after the defeat of Grant at Chicago, Conkling was starting to sour on politics and he was losing his grip on his powerful machine. Garfield saw an opportunity to make inroads into New York, so he went to the summit, which turned out to be less consequential than the newspapers made it out to be. The big story to come out of the summit meeting was that for all his bluster, Conkling didn't show. He said he refused to be in the same room with a man as untrustworthy as Garfield, but he probably didn't mean this. He also let it be known that he would receive Garfield at his retreat on Coney Island. Garfield was exasperated at Conkling's prima donna behavior, and he refused to go. If the presidency is to turn on that, he said, I do not want the office badly enough. This all turned out to be good for Garfield. He negotiated with Conkling's underlings, and they reached an informal deal. They promised Garfield the full support of the New York machine, in exchange for a sort of vague promise that Garfield would at least consider them when giving out political jobs. This was really about it. Despite his reputation as an honest reformer, Garfield was a politician, and he was not above doing the political deals that were necessary to get him elected. Seen in that light, what came to be called the Treaty of Fifth Avenue was pretty smart. To the benefit of Garfield and the Republicans, the Democrats were sort of a mess in 1880. Samuel Tilden, who as you recall had won the popular vote in 1876, was widely expected to be the nominee, at least at first. But the political machine that supported Tilden, the old Tammany Hall machine, split in 1879, and Tilden couldn't bring it back together, so he was basically out. The Democratic Convention held in Cincinnati ultimately nominated former Union Army General Winfield Scott Hancock, who had distinguished himself at the Battle of Gettysburg. Politically, the idea was to neutralize what Democrats expected Republicans' main line of attack would be, which was refighting the Civil War and casting the Democratic Party as having been the party of secession. That was a bit harder to do with a Union general on the ticket. But recall, Garfield was also a former Union Army general who had distinguished himself in combat. So for voters, it was sort of a choice between, well, two Union Army generals from northern states with beards. Because Hancock had no experience in public office and thus no record, Democratic campaigners turned to mudslinging. All of Garfield's scandals were brought up. Credit mobilier, the salary grab, and the de Gaulier pavement thing. Democratic canvassers went around painting the number 329 on everything. Fences, sidewalks, barns, you name it. This was supposed to shame Garfield because $329 was the amount of the quote-unquote loan he received from Oaks Ames. Basically the 1880 equivalent of "Let's go Brandon." Someone even wrote a fake letter with Garfield's signature that made it look like he wanted to keep immigration from China, big issue in 1880, especially in the West, going on, so that railroads could continue to have a supply of cheap labor. Garfield didn't write the letter, but it was published in newspapers, especially in California. For their part, the Republicans didn't really have any new ideas either. The greenbacks and tariffs issue were in the mix, but those weren't exactly barn burners in terms of energizing the electorate. So, Republicans ran exactly the same kind of campaign that had successfully worked in 1868, 1872, and sort of worked in 1876, and exactly what I said they'd do a minute ago, refighting the Civil War and casting the Democratic Party as having been the party of secession. As you know, this was called waving the bloody shirt. As the campaign wore on and the train station in Mentor, Ohio continued to barf up trainload after trainload of visitors and well-wishers who streamed to Garfield's front yard at Lawnfield, eventually Roscoe Conkling himself swallowed his pride and paid a visit. There were no political deals made during this meeting, but the newspapers tried to make something out of it anyway. Voting started in October, and early returns seemed to favor Republicans. But in the end, the 1880 election was close, and I mean really, really close. Garfield beat Hancock in the popular vote by the tiniest margin of popular votes ever in American history, only a few thousand votes. In California, where that fake letter about Chinese immigration was widely published, Hancock won the state by 22 votes. Not 22,000, 22 votes. A very slight shift in the popular vote in some swing states, and Hancock would have won. In the Electoral College, the result was much more decisive. Garfield got 214 electoral votes to Hancock's 155. Garfield did not win a single southern state. Hancock didn't win a single northern one, with the exception of New Jersey. Unfortunately for African Americans, the results of the election proved that Republicans could win presidential elections without their votes, which meant politically there was no will to tamper with the Jim Crow laws that prevented them from voting in the South. This was an unfortunate legacy of the 1880 election. Garfield's major task between the time of the election in November and his inauguration the following March was to assemble a cabinet. In 1880, there were 7 cabinet posts to fill. You'd think this would be easy. You'd be wrong. As we've seen, the Republican Party was a patchwork quilt, barely stitched together, and liable to come apart again at any moment. Garfield had to placate various constituencies within the party, including the stalwarts, but he also had to find people that he could work with, and who would carry out his policies, whatever those turned out to be. The most important decision Garfield made in this period was to ask James G. Blaine, the half-breed's original preferred candidate in 1880 and a good friend, to be Secretary of State. This meant Blaine giving up his long-standing ambition to be president. In December 1880, he accepted. But the selection of Blaine naturally angered the stalwarts, and particularly Roscoe Conkling, who demanded that as compensation, Garfield appoint Conkling's friend Levi Morton as Secretary of the Treasury. In fact, Conkling told Garfield that he, Conkling, understood that the Treasury post had been promised to one of his friends at that thing at the Fifth Avenue Hotel. Garfield had done no such thing, but the confusion over whether he had, and the politics of what to do to placate the angry New York Republicans so consumed Garfield and the party that the matter of cabinet appointments was still unresolved, almost to the day of February 28, 1881, when he had to leave Mentor, Ohio for the inauguration in Washington. But even then, it wasn't finished. With the exception of Robert Lincoln as Secretary of War, each choice Garfield made right down to Postmaster General pissed off either James G. Blaine or offended the New York faction, especially Conkling. Garfield did leave for Washington with what he thought was the final cabinet slate, but it unraveled after the inauguration, thanks to more political infighting and particularly the continued prima donna behavior of Conkling. Garfield was inexperienced. He'd gotten the nomination unexpectedly, and he had made all of his political decisions after that on an ad hoc basis. His administration wasn't starting out well. In a way, you can't blame him. It's not like he'd been dreaming of being president for 35 years and knew exactly what he wanted to do when he got into office. What happened during the brief time he was in office is the subject of the next chapter. As you know by now, Garfield's presidency was the second shortest in American history. He was really only a functioning president under normal circumstances for 120 days between his inauguration on March 4th, 1881, and the day he was shot at that train station, July 2nd, 1881. It may surprise you, but I'm going to spend less time on those 120 days of his functioning presidency than I am any other single aspect of Garfield's life and career. March 4th, 1881, Inauguration Day, was cold and windy, and it had snowed in Washington all the previous night. Garfield's inauguration address was one of the longer ones on record, and given the reviews in the newspapers, not one of the more distinguished ones. He rambled on for a long time with various bromides and platitudes, and inexplicably took the opportunity quite suddenly to condemn the Mormon practice of polygamy. The inaugural ball was held at the Smithsonian Museum, now the Arts and Industries Building of the Smithsonian Institution. While guests gorged themselves on 1,500 pounds of turkey and 100 gallons of oysters, Garfield was distracted with letters and telegrams about trying to reshuffle the cabinet, after various offers were rescinded and some rejected. The public was eager to greet the new president. In 1881, anybody could walk up to the White House and even walk in and demand to see the president, although secretaries and eventually cabinet ministers were judicious in determining which of these appointments would actually be granted. At the beginning of administration, the crowds of visitors numbered in the thousands. Most of them wanted one thing: to be appointed to some political or administrative job. In the 19th century, staffing and personnel really was thought of as the main part of a president's job, not reacting to events and rarely changing broad strokes of policy, although that did sometimes happen. Most of Garfield's early weeks in office were consumed with personnel matters and political fights with allies, enemies, or the Senate over this, that, or the other political appointment. For example, there was a bunch of mishigas over the nomination of William Chandler as Solicitor General, which was controversial because he was a sworn political enemy of Wayne McVeigh, who Garfield had appointed Attorney General. But McVeigh was an enemy of James G. Blaine and also the brother-in-law of Don Cameron, who had tried to railroad the 1880 Republican Convention in favor of Grant. Now, I'm not going to go through all of these personnel controversies. I just mentioned this one as a representative example. The Senate, for the record, rejected Chandler's nomination. Unfortunately, Garfield was apparently railroaded by his Secretary of State, Blaine, who was still waking up every morning wondering how he could stick it to his old enemy, Roscoe Conkling. Eventually, it came down to that old pain in the ass, the New York Customs House. Blaine told Garfield that he, Garfield, should fire the current collector of the Port of New York, Edwin Merritt, and appoint another one of Blaine's friends, William Robertson, in his place. Merritt was a favorite of Conkling. Firing him was going to be a declaration of war. Garfield should have left well enough alone, but once he officially proposed the change to the Senate, he couldn't go back on it. Conkling was furious and humiliated Garfield by being an hour and a half late to a meeting at the White House to discuss the matter. Garfield, now pretty pissed off himself, was determined to ram through the Robertson nomination. He said, quote, "It had better be known in the outset whether the President is the head of the government or the registering clerk of the Senate," end quote. The Senate went into a long filibuster to try to defer the issue. During it, thanks to pressure by Garfield and his allies, Conkling started to lose political support. He realized the Robertson vote was make or break for his continued power in the Senate and in New York machine politics. Conkling's political fortunes were tied to New York's other senator, Thomas Platt. On May 16, 1881, Conkling and Platt decided to resign from the Senate together. The idea was that they would resign, and the New York State Legislature, which chose senators at this time, would then reappoint both of them to the Senate as a way to show Garfield that he couldn't push the Senate around. But it didn't work. Not only did the New York legislature choose two other guys to replace Conkling and Platt, but the newspapers had a field day. One political observer called Conkling, quote, "a great big baby, boo-hooing because he can't have all the cake and refusing to play any longer." This was the end of Roscoe Conkling's 15-year feud with James G. Blaine. It was also a huge moment for President James Garfield. Robertson was confirmed as the port collector. The newspapers, hungry for drama, loved it. While this was going on, in early May, the new First Lady, Crete Garfield, became dreadfully ill. It was probably malaria, which was still endemic in Washington, D.C., even toward the end of the 19th century. Garfield sat by her bedside every night. Sometimes he even carried her from room to room. By the end of May, Lucretia was starting to recover. The first couple decided she should go to the Jersey Shore to recuperate. Gilded Age presidents often did this sort of thing, preferring beachside resort towns like Elberon and Long Branch. At the end of the month, Lucretia left for a summer house on loan at the Jersey Shore, with the plan being that the president and family would catch up with her later. During his brief presidency, Garfield made moves towards strengthening U.S. relations with Latin American countries. That was mostly James Blaine's project, and he also had Secretary of the Treasury William Windom refinance $200 million of the national debt by exchanging outstanding bonds for new ones with lower interest rates. Never mind what that means. The upshot was that it saved $10 million in the national budget. But to be honest, there really wasn't that much going on during the 120 days that Garfield was president and fully functioning as chief executive. Congress's special session ended on May 20th, 1881. It wasn't scheduled to be back in session again till December. There were no major foreign or domestic crises on his watch. Indeed, as the weather got hotter, Washington virtually closed down in the deep summer months, and politicians, even the president, got out of town for cooler climates. This was exactly the plan as Garfield and his sons prepared for their summer vacation. The first stop would be Elberon, New Jersey, where the president would reunite with his wife. So that brings us back to where we started, the tragic events of July 2nd, 1881 at the 6th Street station. We're now going to leave Garfield for a few minutes and take a look at the man who shot him in that waiting room, and why. I'm a historian, not a psychologist, and I'm sure somebody is going to argue with me in the comments about the conclusion I'm about to make. But looking at the life and personality of one Charles Julius Guiteau, it's impossible for me to conclude anything other than he was simply insane. The story of Guiteau and his insanity really begins with the story of a religious cult called the Oneida Community. In the early 19th century, America was swept with a wave of religious revivals, an amorphous movement that historians have often called the Second Great Awakening. Preachers, prophets, and would-be saviors were going around everywhere, particularly in the Northeast, calling people to Christ, or sometimes proclaiming they were Christ, or had some special revelation of him. The most enduring legacy of the Second Great Awakening was the denomination of Mormonism, whose founder, Joseph Smith, was one of those would-be prophets. But there were lots of others. Another was a man called John Humphrey Noyes, who preached that Christ's second coming had already happened in 70 CE, but everybody was so distracted at the time that no one noticed. Though Noyes never killed anybody, had them brand themselves with their initials or drove them to lonely suicides in the desert, at least that we know of, Noyes did have some things in common with cult leaders like Charles Manson, Keith Raniere, or Carlos Castaneda. He founded a very insular breakaway community, the Oneida community, and carefully prescribed his followers' sexual behavior. Charles Guiteau's father was an admirer of Noyes, though he never actually joined the Oneida community. Charles, born in 1841 in Freeport, Illinois, flunked the entrance exam at the University of Michigan, and at age 19 in 1860, he decided to run away to the Oneida colony. Unfortunately, Noyes' teachings amplified what were probably narcissistic tendencies that existed in Guiteau from the beginning. Guiteau came to believe that he was literally perfect, that he would succeed Noyes as the leader of the cult, and that he would eventually become President of the United States. His narcissistic behavior alienated members of the cult, and in 1865 they kicked him out. This experience earned him his nickname, Charles Gitout. After being cast out of Oneida, Guiteau tried first to bill Noyes for the work he said he did at the commune. Then, when that was rebuffed, he tried to blackmail them by exposing the sexual practices of the group, especially where young women were involved. He never got a dime from the cult, although it is true that John Humphrey Noyes eventually fled to Canada to avoid a statutory rape charge. Having failed as a prophet, Guiteau next decided he was a lawyer. Incredibly, he managed to pass an exam and was admitted to the bar. The bar exams in Chicago in the early 1870s were obviously pretty lax. Guiteau tried one case for petty larceny, but the screaming, rambling, incoherent harangue that he gave to the jury caused them to convict his client on the spot without even retiring to the jury room. In this period, Guiteau also got married. His poor wife, a woman named Annie Bunn, was a librarian. Even after getting married, Guiteau wouldn't stop frequenting sex workers, from whom he caught syphilis and then passed it on to his wife. She divorced him. In 1872, in addition to syphilis, Guiteau caught the whiff of politics. He was heavily attracted to the campaign of, guess who, Horace Greeley, in 1872. Showing up uninvited to Greeley campaign rallies, Guiteau wrote a speech talking up Greeley, which he convinced would carry him to victory, whereupon the new President Greeley would reward him with a cushy government job. Even after Greeley lost and then died, Guiteau couldn't shake this fantasy. Later in the 1870s, Guiteau again tried his hand as an evangelist. He wrote and self-published a book called The Truth, which was literally one of John Humphrey Noyes' books, plagiarized. Unable to hold down a steady job, Guiteau constantly scraped, schemed, and mooched off of people for money. He grew to be a nuisance to his own family. When his brother John asked Charles to repay $7 that he had borrowed, Charles Guiteau sent it to him in an envelope with a note that read, "Stick it up your bunghole." The Guiteau family tried to have Charles committed to an insane asylum in 1875, but somehow he wormed out of it. In early 1880, Guiteau was living in Boston. As the political season heated up again, he pulled out his old 1872 speech for Greeley, crossed out Greeley's name, and filled in Grant, who he, along with many others, expected to be the Republican nominee. On June 11, 1880, shortly after the end of the Chicago Convention that nominated Garfield, Guiteau was traveling aboard a steamship called the SS Stonington on Long Island Sound. In heavy fog, the Stonington collided with another ship. The other ship, the Narragansett, caught fire and burned to the waterline, killing about 50 people. Guiteau wasn't injured in the disaster, but he became convinced that God had personally spared him so that he could accomplish a great mission, the election of James Garfield, which presumably would lead to higher office for Charles Guiteau. Pulling out his old speech again, Guiteau crossed out the name Grant, filled in Garfield's name, and tacked on a paragraph at the end, talking him up. Then, he went to New York and staked out the Fifth Avenue Hotel, which, as you recall, was the site of the Comedy of Errors summit meeting between Garfield and Roscoe Conkling. Guiteau had a bunch of copies of his speech printed up, and he passed them out to Republican leaders who came in and out of the hotel. This activity utterly convinced Guiteau that his intervention was going to ensure Garfield's victory. Even before the election, he was writing letters to the candidate, enclosing copies of his speech and suggesting that as a reward, Garfield should appoint him ambassador to Austria-Hungary. Garfield's narrow election poured more fuel on the fire. Now Guiteau, convinced that Garfield owed his office solely to him, changed his mind and decided he wanted to be ambassador to France instead. Receiving no replies to his deranged letters, after the inauguration, Guiteau arrived in Washington to press his claims in person. This is where Guiteau's story intersects the broader issue of office seekers and civil service reform. As I said in the last chapter, thousands of office seekers flooded the White House when a new president took office, and they could be admitted freely to the presidential mansion, though their chances of actually seeing the chief were even money at best. Guiteau found himself one of these thousands, but somehow he actually did manage to get an audience with President James Garfield. He handed Garfield a copy of his speech, which he'd written Paris consulship on the top of. Garfield said nothing. Guiteau was ushered out and placated with some vague statements about his application being forwarded to the State Department. That caused Guiteau to fixate for a time on James G. Blaine, Secretary of State. He became such a pest, accosting Blaine outside the State Department, that on May 13, 1881, Blaine blew up at him, shouting, "Never speak to me again on the Paris consulship as long as you live." A few days later, on May 18th, Guiteau apparently decided that the president had to die. Guiteau spent 6 weeks stalking Garfield. He bought the revolver he used, nicknamed the British Bulldog, choosing it over a less expensive model because he thought it would look good in a glass case in a museum after he killed the president. Guiteau even visited the jail in Washington where he expected to be confined. Actually getting close to Garfield wasn't hard. There was no Secret Service protection, no bodyguards, nothing. Even after Lincoln's assassination 16 years earlier, Garfield traveled freely throughout Washington, sometimes with his family. On one occasion, Guiteau stalked him at his church, but decided shooting him through the window was too difficult a shot. He kept careful track of the president's comings and goings. Eventually, he was attracted to the railway station. Garfield was there 3 times that summer. First on June 18th to take Lucretia to the Jersey shore. Garfield then returned without her on June 27th. Each of those times, Guiteau was laying in wait. The first time, he decided he didn't want to shoot Garfield in front of his wife. The second time, it was too hot or something. Nothing the guy said made much sense. The third time, though, was the morning of July 2nd. Because Garfield was scheduled to leave and be gone all summer, this was basically Guiteau's last chance, unless he wanted to wait a couple of months. That Saturday morning, Guiteau got up at 4 a.m. He had a big breakfast and went for a walk, had his shoes shined, and then went to the railroad station. He left a bundle of papers on a bench, including a letter that explained why he did it, that Garfield's death was a, quote, political necessity, and that he did not hate the president personally. Not long after 9, Guiteau in the waiting room saw Garfield and Blaine walk right by him. He popped up, aimed his pistol, and pumped a slug into Garfield's back. Though Guiteau's understanding of politics was rudimentary, after going through both the political story of 1880 and Guiteau's twisted psychology, I hope you now understand the meaning of the phrase he said to Officer Kearney as he was being led away. "I am a stalwart. Arthur is now President of the United States." Guiteau erroneously thought he was responsible for making Garfield President of the United States with his half-baked speech. Now in his narcissism, he believed that he was literally responsible for making Chester Arthur president. Unfortunately, in a way, he was right, although Garfield's doctors, and especially Dr. Bliss, had a large hand in it. We're nearing the end of our story, but that tragic part of it is the next chapter. What little popular interest there is in James Garfield, especially in this century, has tended to focus on the brief sliver of his life after the shooting but before his death, what I'll term the medical story. Not many ordinary people know a lot of facts about Garfield, but one fact that does tend to be known, and which is probably true, is that Garfield's doctors mostly killed him. I'm not going to spend a tremendous amount of time on the medical story for two reasons. First, I'm generally more interested in Garfield's life than the manner of his death. And second, an exhaustive account of the medical story involves discussing a lot of gross stuff that might get this video age-restricted or demonetized. And in any event, I'm not a huge fan of that kind of thing. On the day of the shooting, most observers and most of the doctors who tended Garfield thought he wouldn't live until morning. But as the hours wore on, his condition seemed a bit more stable. There were no signs of internal bleeding, and his pulse and temperature approached normal. The worst thing was that he couldn't keep any food down. Garfield barfed every half hour. To be sure, he'd long suffered from digestive ailments. In fact, on the advice of his doctors, for years Garfield had eaten for lunch sandwiches made of stale bread and raw beef, supposedly to improve his digestion. How it was supposed to do that and how he didn't die of salmonella or tapeworms long before Guiteau shot him, I will never know. At 7 p.m. on Saturday, Lucretia arrived from New Jersey. She and Double Dr. Bliss were about the only company Garfield was allowed to have. At 9 a.m. on the morning of July 3rd, Dr. Jedediah Baxter, who had been Garfield's personal doctor for 5 years, showed up at the White House. Bliss refused to let him see the president. In fact, the two got into a shouting match, and Dr. Baxter stormed off in a huff. Later that day, Bliss sent out a form letter to all the doctors who had treated Garfield the day before, stating that his condition was favorable and they were no longer needed, quote, at the request of the president. That was a lie, but no one called him on it. Crete, the First Lady, eventually summoned two doctors of her choosing, Dr. Susan Ann Edson, who had previously treated the Garfield family, and Dr. Silas Boynton, who was in fact Garfield's cousin. When they got there, Double Dr. Bliss made clear to them that he was in charge and that they would be allowed only to perform nursing duties. Incredibly, they agreed to this, possibly as the only means by which they were allowed to stay and thus keep an eye on Dr. Bliss. Arthur, the vice president, who was in New York at the time of the shooting, virtually went into hiding. First, at the Fifth Avenue Hotel, where his friend and patron Roscoe Conkling was staying, and then at his own house on Lexington Avenue. He was terrified of being seen as trying to take advantage of the situation. In fact, Arthur was terrified that Garfield would die and he'd be president, a job that he thought he had no aptitude for. Arthur kept a very low profile over the next 2 months. Double Dr. Bliss was strangely obsessed with locating the bullet in Garfield's body. It didn't really matter because he wasn't bleeding and removing it wouldn't have made a whole lot of difference to his condition. But Bliss kept sticking dirty instruments up the bullet hole trying to find it. At the end of July, Bliss accepted an entree from inventor Alexander Graham Bell, who claimed to have devised a machine, a primitive metal detector, that would probe the president's body electrically and locate the bullet. Bell had reached out to the White House, offering to help. Bell brought his machine, called the induction balance, to the White House, and he was one of the few visitors admitted to the sick room. Garfield was held on his side, and Bell waved the sensor arm over him, but the results were inconclusive. Later, it was determined that not only were they looking on the wrong side of Garfield's body, but the metal bed springs were interfering with the device. The induction balance, alas, didn't save Garfield's life, and it wouldn't have even if it worked properly. What probably would have saved him was the germ theory of disease and the antiseptic procedures introduced by Dr. Joseph Lister, which were relatively new in 1881. I talked about Lister at some length in my video about the history of urban poop. Suffice it to say, despite considerable evidence that cleanliness and sanitary procedures really did improve patient outcomes, many doctors in the US and Britain, even as late as 1881, thought Lister was a quack and his theories were a waste of time. Bliss certainly thought so. This is principally why people maintain that if he'd had another doctor, Garfield may well have survived. Lost in all the discussion about Garfield's medical procedures is the experience of the poor man himself. To say he suffered the tortures of the damned during this whole thing is an understatement. Garfield could rarely sit up. Most of the time he lay flat on his back and attendants had to move him, 15 or 20 times a day to avoid bed sores. He couldn't eat, barfing up nearly everything he was given. For some reason, Double Dr. Bliss insisted on feeding him rich stuff like lamb chops, despite the fact that even when he was healthy, Garfield generally didn't eat like that. Because of the vomiting problem, Garfield lost weight prodigiously. At the time of the shooting, he was a robust man, portly even, about 200 pounds. At the end, he was a 130-pound weakling. Still, throughout all the ordeals, the poking, prodding, and turning, he was unfailingly polite to Bliss and the White House attendants, always thanking them for their service. As if it could get worse than laying there dying of sepsis, the summer of 1881 was extremely hot and humid on the East Coast. Washington was a Dutch oven in July and August. A group of engineers from the U.S. Navy rigged up a primitive air conditioner in the White House using a blower and a chest full of ice. The device had to be modified because the original version was incredibly noisy, and Bliss insisted that noise disturbed the president. Ultimately, 6 tons of ice were used during Garfield's convalescence. By August, though, it was clear that Garfield was dying. He was running a fever, and evidence of infection was breaking out all over his body. In the 19th century, they called it blood poisoning, and Double Dr. Bliss, running true to form, was in denial, constantly stating that there was no evidence of blood poisoning, when in fact it was perfectly obvious. Garfield himself knew he was dying. He insisted that they take him away from the White House to some place where he could see the ocean. The obvious choice was Long Branch and Elberon, New Jersey, where they had stayed before, and in fact where Lucretia had been convalescing after her bout with malaria. A gas company magnate named Charles Franklin, grandson of passenger line founder Samuel Cunard, donated his expansive quote-unquote cottage at Elberon for the president's recuperation. I want to put cottage in quotes because it was actually more of a mansion with more than 20 rooms, some cottage. Volunteers from the Long Branch and Elberon area had built a spur of railroad track over 3,000 feet long, going from the Elberon station right up to the door of the Franklin house. When Garfield was transferred from Washington to Elberon on a special train on September 6, 1881, many of these same volunteers pushed the train car by hand down this spur to the cottage. Garfield really did rally once he got to the Jersey shore. He was well enough to be propped up in bed, looking out the window at the ocean. Double Dr. Bliss was so encouraged that he dismissed much of the staff who'd been looking after him, and Garfield's daily needs were taken care of by 2 of his old army and political buddies, Alman Rockwell and David Swaim. Swaim, in fact, a close friend of Garfield, was also Judge Advocate General of the United States. Bliss did occasionally allow consulting surgeons to look at Garfield. One of them, Dr. Hayes Agnew, trashed Bliss's optimistic prognosis and said the president would be dead within a week. Garfield's last days were agonizing. His temperature spiked to 108 degrees Fahrenheit. He had a hacking cough, probably pneumonia. At 10 p.m. on September 19, 1881, Garfield gurgled, clutched his chest, and shouted, "Oh, Swaim, this pain." Those were his last words. He died at 10:35 p.m. It was 80 days since the shooting. An autopsy was performed in a downstairs room of the Franklin house the next day, September 20th. The results are pretty gross. All I'll say about it, except that there was overwhelming evidence of the sepsis or blood poisoning that Double Dr. Bliss had continually denied. Anyway, the big evidence was that they discovered that the doctors were wrong about where the bullet had gone. It ended up on the left side of Garfield's body, not the right, and as it was encased in tissue, removing it wouldn't have made any difference. The bullet had also gone through Garfield's spine. A piece of Garfield's spine showing the bullet hole remains in the archival collection of the National Museum of Health and Medicine. It sits in a drawer. In the same drawer, ironically, is a piece of the spine of John Wilkes Booth, Lincoln's assassin. Despite Guiteau's careful selection of the British Bulldog revolver for how it would look in a museum, and despite the fact that it was given to the Smithsonian Institution, the Smithsonian lost it over the years. No one to this day knows where it is. This is Calustan's Market, located at 123 Lexington Avenue in New York City. Though today a Middle Eastern grocery store, the building in which it's located, which is original, is the one that was Chester Arthur's townhouse during the 19th century. He moved in 1848. It was here, in the space now occupied by bags of exotic Asian tea, that Arthur had his front parlor. At about 2:15 in the morning of September 20th, 1881, possibly in the space where this guy is standing to take the picture, Chester Arthur took the oath of office as the 21st President of the United States. The news of Garfield's death had reached Arthur in New York just after midnight. This was the second and last of two presidential inaugurations to take place in New York City, the other being George Washington's in 1789. When Garfield was shot on July 2nd, many Americans were horrified at the idea of Chester Arthur becoming president. He was, as I said earlier in the video, the poster boy for political corruption, and his entire claim to fame was that whole mess involving the New York Customs House. Furthermore, in the public mind, Garfield's death had been caused, at least indirectly, by corruption. Guiteau was an office seeker, thinking he had done a political favor for Garfield, which he hoped to convert into a cushy political job. His anger at not getting one was what most people think caused him to blow away the president. There were even conspiracy theories, completely unfounded of course, that Arthur had hired Guiteau to shoot Garfield to make him president. Guiteau referencing Arthur in his statement made on the scene didn't help tamp these down. By the time of the inauguration, though, Arthur had already begun to turn his back on his corrupt ways. In August 1881, while Garfield was dying, Arthur had begun to receive letters from a woman called Julia Sand, an invalid who lived on 74th Street, not that far from Arthur's home on Lexington Avenue. Julia believed in Chester Arthur and urged him to rise above the low opinion most Americans had of him. He took her advice. In his first public address after Garfield's death, Arthur called for comprehensive civil service reform, sweeping away the spoils system and draining the swamp of office seekers that had grown the odious tadpole of Charles Guiteau. After a great deal of political wrangling, Arthur eventually signed such an act called the Pendleton Act in 1883. Roscoe Conkling, the old New York machine politician, was horrified at Arthur's about-face. He had expected to salvage his reputation and get at least some of his cronies back on the gravy train. When he visited the new President Arthur at the White House, Conkling demanded that Arthur fire the collector of the Port of New York, William Robertson, whose appointment by Garfield had so offended him. Conkling also wanted to be named Secretary of State in place of James Blaine, who resigned a few months after Garfield's death. Arthur refused both requests. Conkling went away furious and stayed that way for the rest of his life. Arthur even tried to mend fences in a fashion by nominating Conkling for the U.S. Supreme Court, and Conkling was even confirmed by the Senate. But he refused to serve, stating in a letter to Arthur that he was declining for, quote, reasons you cannot fail to appreciate. Conkling died of pneumonia after walking 3 miles home from his law office during the Great Blizzard of 1888, which dropped feet of snow on New York City. Conkling's great rival, James G. Blaine, knew that with the ascension of Arthur to the White House, he would no longer be able to exert the influence he'd had over Garfield. Indeed, most of Garfield's cabinet members jumped ship one by one, even though the new president asked them to stay at least until the convening of Congress in December. Blaine resigned that month, and although out of office, he wasn't out of politics. He regrouped and made a serious bid for the Republican nomination in 1884. At the convention, Blaine was the strongest candidate, despite a token block of delegates holding out for Arthur, who wasn't a serious candidate for reasons I'll discuss in a moment. Blaine did eventually get the nomination on the 4th ballot, but having been in the political wilderness for years, Democrats finally got it together in 1884 and nominated Grover Cleveland, governor of New York. The main issue, amazingly, was anti-corruption. Cleveland had a reputation for being an honest, clean house type of reformer. Despite skeletons in his own closet, including a love child he had had out of wedlock, Cleveland won the 1884 election, narrowly, the first uncontested Democratic presidential victory since 1856. Blaine finally realized his long-standing presidential aspirations were not going to come true. He stood down in the 1888 contest, but was rewarded by being named Secretary of State once again by President Benjamin Harrison. He resigned from that post in 1892 for family and health reasons. Blaine died at his home in Washington in early 1893. Lucretia Garfield survived her husband by almost 40 years. After his death, she became the custodian of his memory and reputation, collecting and organizing Garfield's papers into a cohesive and well-organized body of material, essentially the first presidential library. This video would not be nearly as complete without her efforts, because almost all the sources I used to make it relied heavily on Garfield's papers. Creed eventually moved to Pasadena, California, and eventually became a Democrat supporting Woodrow Wilson. For the rest of her life, she wrote letters on stationery surrounded with black borders as a symbol of mourning for her long-dead husband. She died in 1918. Two of the Garfield sons, specifically the two who were present at the shooting, went into government service themselves. Henry, known as Hal, served as president of Williams College, Garfield's alma mater. He left that position when President Woodrow Wilson asked him to head up the U.S. Fuel Administration during World War I. Hal Garfield died in 1942. James Rudolph Garfield served in the Ohio State Senate as his father had, and held various other government positions. He became particularly close with Theodore Roosevelt and served as Roosevelt's Secretary of the Interior from 1907 to 1909. James R. Garfield's grandson married into the family of former President Benjamin Harrison. James Rudolph Garfield died in 1950. Dr. Willard Bliss, who was in such deep denial during Garfield's medical crisis, remained so afterwards. He insisted that the president had not died of blood poisoning and that he'd done everything right. Most of the medical profession disagreed. In years of editorials and opinion letters that emerged afterwards, many written by doctors, the conventional wisdom that Bliss's negligent treatment of Garfield ultimately killed him crystallized into public opinion. Bliss himself would have none of it. He submitted a bill to Congress for his services for $25,000, almost $800,000 in today's money. Congress responded essentially with an upraised middle finger. Ultimately, they agreed to pay him $6,500, but Bliss, outraged and insulted, refused to take it. Nevertheless, his reputation was ruined, and his practice was essentially dead. Bliss himself died in 1889. Charles Guiteau remained as much of an obnoxious troll after Garfield's death as he'd been leading up to it. In his narcissistic delusions, he came to believe that the people of the United States considered him a hero for eliminating Garfield, and Guiteau quietly planned to run for President of the United States in 1884, after he was inevitably acquitted of murder. Of course, it didn't work that way. His trial began in November 1881. After his first lawyer quit in frustration, Guiteau was defended by his brother-in-law, also a lawyer. They tried a defense of temporary insanity. During the trial, Guiteau heckled and shouted at the judge, the jurors, witnesses, and his own lawyer. Though it was self-evident that he was completely nuts, insanity has, and had in 1881, a legal definition quite divorced from the admittedly imperfect conception most of us have of insanity as a matter of mental health. Nevertheless, the jury refused to buy it. On January 25, 1882, Guiteau was found guilty. He shouted that the jury were jackasses as he was dragged out of the courtroom. He then appealed to President Arthur to commute his death sentence, noting that he had doubled Arthur's salary by making him president. He simply couldn't understand why the country didn't wholeheartedly embrace him and what he had done. On June 30th, 1882, 2 days short of a year after he shot Garfield, Charles Guiteau was hanged at a D.C. jail. His last request was to read to the crowd a turgid poem he had composed in jail called I Am Going to the Lordy. He had originally requested an orchestra to play as he read his poem, but that request was denied. The poem was later incorporated into Stephen Sondheim's 1992 musical Assassins as a musical number. Guiteau probably would have been delighted. Guiteau's brain was pickled in a jar and remains in the archives of the National Museum of Health and Medicine. It was also discovered that Guiteau had a sexual dysfunction, but whether this played any role in his mental state is impossible to determine. The most surprising legacy of Garfield's assassination was the presidency of Chester Arthur. The expectations for him when he succeeded to the big chair in September 1881 could hardly have been lower. But Arthur surprised most Americans, serving for the most part as a wise, honest, and judicious president. He resisted the highly racist Chinese Exclusion Act, but ultimately signed a compromise version of it after intense political pressure from Congress. Arthur also took publicly unpopular stands for African American civil rights and a much more conciliatory policy toward Native Americans than most people were willing to stand for in the 1880s. Arthur set in motion the modernization of the U.S. Navy that became quite useful in the succeeding decade as America got into the imperialism game with the Spanish-American War. The accomplishments of Arthur's presidency are even more remarkable given his personal circumstances. He was a widower, his wife having died of pneumonia in January 1880, more than a year and a half before he became president, but he never got over her death. Arthur himself was in poor health. Not long after he became president, he was diagnosed with what was called in the 19th century Bright's disease, nephritis, a kidney ailment. It was fatal at that time and is in advanced cases today. Chester Arthur therefore knew he was terminally ill during virtually his entire presidency. Though he went through the motions of trying to keep a potential candidacy alive for the 1884 election cycle, delegates pledged to him were a significant bloc at the Republican convention that year, his heart wasn't in it, and the Republicans, as we've seen, preferred Blaine. Arthur left office quietly in March 1885 and returned home to New York City. He died in November 1886. About 90 years later, in January 1976, a young cartoonist from Indiana, James Robert Davis, began drawing a comic strip called simply John, Jon. It featured a semi-autobiographical cartoonist, John Arbuckle, and his lazy, loafing orange Persian cat, Garfield. Davis did not name the cat after President James Garfield. However, that doesn't mean there isn't a connection. He named his character after his grandfather, James A. Garfield Davis, who was named for President James Garfield. Garfield, the revamped comic strip featuring the cartoon cat, was picked up for national syndication in 1978 and has since become a merchandising empire. In 1983, Berkeley Breathed, the cartoonist who drew the satirical strip Bloom County, made a joke out of the connection between Garfield the cat and Garfield the president, imagining a comic strip in which the president is the main character, hating Mondays and presumably craving lasagna. James Garfield was not a transformative figure in American history. He just wasn't. You can't make a case for him being one of the great presidents. Not only was he in office far too short a time to make a big difference, but in the Gilded Age, U.S. presidents simply weren't as consequential as they are now. Even the men who became president in that era, those bland faces of bearded and mustachioed white men with whom Garfield becomes somewhat indistinguishable, generally agreed that Congress, not the White House, was the major engine of the American government. The president's touch on the tiller of the ship of state was relatively light in the late 1800s, and that wouldn't change really until the 20th century. With all that said, Garfield's life story is far from insignificant or forgettable. What stands out about his story is the curious mix of potential greatness and ordinariness too. Garfield was highly educated, one of the smartest men ever to be president, yet his extraordinary brains didn't translate into a gift for exercising political power. Garfield was generally honest, but he was also a politician, and he got entrapped in various scandals over the course of his career. He was sort of ambitious, but also sort of not, preferring that offices be handed to him with no strings attached. Yet he wasn't above jockeying skillfully to be the right place to receive them, if they were offered. He was a loving family man who had, at least at first, kind of a cold relationship with his wife. He was a general who served his country, but not a war hero and far from a military genius. Nearly everything about Garfield, the good and the bad, is qualified. Yes, he was this, but he was also that. You gotta kind of admire him, but at the same time, he doesn't really seem like the stuff that heroes are made of. While he lay dying in the Franklin house in Elberon, New Jersey, and while he was looking out at the ocean, James Garfield asked his friend Allan Rockwell, "Do you think my name will have a place in human history?" Rockwell is said to have replied, "Yes, a grand one, but grander in human hearts." I have no idea whether that's true, but if nothing else, I spent several weeks making this video about James Garfield, and you spent 2.5 hours watching it. More than 140 years after his death, at least someone remembers him. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, share it, recommend it to others, do all the stuff that you normally do for a video you like. The sources I used to make this video are listed in the credits at the end and also in the description. No part of the research or writing of this video was done with AI. I teach history courses on my website, seanmunger.com. I also have a new book out, a mystery novel, Daniel Vanished, which is available on Amazon Kindle and in paperback. The link to that is in the description. Thank you to all my fans and supporters, and thank you once again for joining me on another journey into the past.